What if the fate of an entire nation rested in the hands of a foreign king, chosen by God to fulfill a prophecy centuries in the making? The story of Persia's unexpected role in Israel's restoration challenges everything we think we know about divine intervention in history. The ancient kingdom of Elam, located in the region that would later become Iran, emerges in the Bible as one of the earliest and most significant powers of the ancient world. Elam's history predates even the rise of Israel, playing a pivotal role in the narratives of Genesis. Situated to the east of Mesopotamia, the Elamites are first mentioned in the Bible during the story of the Tower of Babel, where the descendants of Noah's sons are dispersed across the earth, marking the beginning of the nations. Elam is one of the earliest kingdoms listed in this dispersion, emphasizing its early and integral role in the ancient Near Eastern world. In Genesis, Elam is introduced as the land of one of Noah's great-grandsons, Shem. The mention of Elam here is not just a geographical reference but a reflection of the kingdom's enduring presence throughout the ancient biblical history. Elam's significance is further highlighted when we consider that it was among the nations that participated in the geopolitics of the ancient world, often finding itself in conflict or alliance with the great powers of the day. Elam's proximity to Mesopotamia made it a central player in the early developments of civilization, with its influence extending far beyond its borders. The most notable reference to Elam in the Bible is found in the book of Genesis, where it is mentioned alongside other nations as a participant in the battle between the kings of the East and the kings of the West. This event, known as the Battle of the Kings, serves as a backdrop to the story of Abram's rescue of his nephew Lot. Elam, under its king, Chedorlaomer, leads a coalition of kings against the forces of Sodom and Gomorrah, underscoring the kingdom's military might and its central role in the region's political landscape. Later biblical references to Elam, particularly in the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah, reveal the kingdom's prominence during the times of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Despite its eventual subjugation by these empires, the legacy of Elam would live on, particularly in its connection to the Persian Empire. The Persian kings, such as Cyrus the Great, hailed from the region once known as Elam, linking the ancient kingdom to the rise of one of the most influential empires in biblical prophecy. In this way, Elam not only serves as a historical backdrop in Genesis but also as a precursor to the Persian Empire, whose kings would later play a significant role in the return of the Jewish people from Babylonian exile. Thus, Elam's importance in biblical history lies not just in its geographical or political significance, but also in its enduring legacy as the foundation for the Persian Empire, a kingdom that would fulfill divine prophecies and contribute to the fulfillment of God's plan for Israel. The ancient kingdom of Elam, with its early references in the Bible, remains an essential part of the tapestry of biblical history, marking the beginning of a long and intricate relationship between the Bible and the land of Iran. The story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible offers a fascinating glimpse into the ancient world, and it is within this narrative that the Elamites are introduced. As humanity united in its ambition to build a tower that reached the heavens, the Lord, observing the pride and arrogance of mankind, chose to confuse their language, scattering them across the earth. This event, recounted in Genesis, marks a pivotal moment in the early history of humanity, and the Elamites emerge as one of the many peoples scattered as a result of this divine intervention. The Elamites, the descendants of Shem, are among the first nations to be dispersed following the Babel incident. Positioned to the east of Mesopotamia, their homeland lay at the crossroads of major ancient civilizations. The significance of the Elamites' inclusion in this event lies in their early establishment as a distinct people. In the wake of Babel's confusion, the Elamites were scattered to the region that would become the heart of their kingdom, located in the land east of the Tigris River. This region, which included parts of modern-day Iran, would later become the center of the Elamite civilization, known for its rich culture, language, and contributions to the ancient world. The mention of the Elamites in the context of the Tower of Babel signifies more than just their geographical placement. It highlights the biblical theme of divine judgment and the consequences of human pride. The people of Babel sought to make a name for themselves, constructing a tower that symbolized their desire to reach heaven and assert their power. By scattering humanity and creating linguistic barriers, God ensured that no such unified human effort could threaten the divine order. The Elamites, like many other groups, found themselves part of this divine dispersion, forced to establish their own identities and cultures in lands far from the once unified civilization. This dispersion of peoples also laid the groundwork for the future of the Elamite civilization. The Elamites, no longer part of a unified Babel but distinct in their language and customs, became a significant force in the ancient world. Over time, they built a kingdom that interacted with neighboring civilizations, including Mesopotamia, and were often involved in both conflict and cooperation with these empires. The mention of the Elamites in the Babel story serves as the beginning of a long history, with the kingdom of Elam playing a key role in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East. Thus, the Elamites' connection to the Tower of Babel is not merely a matter of geography, it is a reminder of the divine hand in shaping the fate of nations. In the chaos that followed the scattering of peoples, the Elamites found their place, contributing to the rich tapestry of ancient history. Their mention in this early biblical narrative ties them to the larger story of humanity's attempt to reach beyond their limits and the divine intervention that shaped the world as it is known today. Abraham's journey, as recorded in the Bible, is one of faith, promise, and divine encounters, and it brings him through lands that would become central to the history of the ancient Near East, including the region of Elam. While Abraham is often remembered for his role as the father of many nations, his sojourn in the land of Canaan and his travels beyond its borders also tie him to the world of the Elamites, highlighting the deep interconnections between Abraham's story and the ancient kingdoms of the time. The first notable connection between Abraham and Elam comes when he is called by God to leave Ur, the city of his birth, and journey to the land that God would show him. Ur, located in southern Mesopotamia, was part of the broader region that included Elam to the east. While Abraham's primary journey takes him to Canaan, he passes through the territories of powerful civilizations, and Elam, with its cultural and geopolitical significance, looms large in the backdrop of his travels. The Elamites, whose kingdom was located in the region just east of Mesopotamia, were known to have had interactions with the other prominent powers of the ancient world, and Abraham would have certainly encountered their influence during his travels. However, it is not just the geographical proximity that ties Abraham to Elam, but also a pivotal encounter that would become a defining moment in his life. After Abraham's rescue of his nephew Lot from captivity, he returns victorious and is met by Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Melchizedek, described as both a king and a priest of the Most High God, blesses Abraham and offers him bread and wine. This moment is significant not only for its theological implications but also for its historical context. Salem, which many scholars identify as an early form of Jerusalem, was a place that had ties to the broader region of Canaan and its surrounding territories, including Elam. Melchizedek, as a figure who transcends the usual borders of political and cultural divisions, represents a connection between the different lands and peoples of the ancient world. His encounter with Abraham underscores the theme of divine intervention and blessing that transcends human boundaries, as Melchizedek's priesthood is seen as a forerunner to the priesthood of Christ in Christian theology. In addition to the blessings shared between Abraham and Melchizedek, another significant detail of this encounter is the mention of the Elamite king, Chedorlaomer, who was part of the alliance that captured Lot. Chedorlaomer, identified as the king of Elam, plays a key role in the biblical narrative when Abraham leads a small group of men to rescue Lot and defeat the Elamite king. This battle highlights the presence and power of Elam in the ancient world, as well as Abraham's ability to confront mighty kings in defense of his family and his faith. Abraham's triumph over Chedorlaomer and his allies is an early testament to his role as a warrior, blessed by God. and solidifies the theme of divine providence in Abraham's life. Abraham's connection to Elam, therefore, is more than a mere passing reference. It ties him to the broader geopolitical currents of the ancient world. His journey intersects with the land of Elam in ways that reflect both the conflicts and divine encounters that would shape the future of his descendants. The kingdom of Elam, with its kings and rulers, provides an important backdrop to Abraham's story, highlighting the complexity of the ancient world and the profound role that faith and divine intervention played in the shaping of history. During the time of the patriarchs, the region of Elam held significant sway over the ancient Near East, influencing the course of events that would shape the destiny of Israel and its people. While Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are often associated with the lands of Canaan, their interactions with neighboring kingdoms, including Elam, reveal the interconnectedness of the ancient world. The Elamites, situated to the east of Mesopotamia, were not just distant neighbors but active participants in the geopolitical dynamics of the time, and their role in the lives of the patriarchs is woven into the biblical narrative. Abraham's encounters with Elamite power are perhaps the most direct, especially in relation to the Elamite king Chedorlaomer, as mentioned earlier. Chedorlaomer's brief but pivotal role in the biblical story, as one of the kings involved in the capture of Lot and his eventual defeat by Abraham, highlights Elam's military and political importance during this period. The Elamite king's invasion of the Jordan Valley was part of a larger alliance that aimed to maintain control over the region, and when Abraham rescues his nephew, it demonstrates not only his courage but the rising tension between the various kingdoms of the ancient world, including Elam. Though Elam is not frequently mentioned in subsequent patriarchal stories, its influence is implicit, as its kings and their armies posed a significant threat to the smaller, more dispersed groups like the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, while more directly involved with the nations surrounding Canaan, were still impacted by Elamite power in subtle ways. For instance, the movements and migrations of the Semitic peoples, those descended from Abraham, were often dictated by the changing balance of power in the Near East, and Elam's role as a significant power was felt through its alliances and conflicts. Jacob's life, especially during his time in Haran and his subsequent return to Canaan, was shaped by these broader geopolitical currents. As he made his way back to Canaan, Jacob's interactions with his uncle Laban in the region of Padan Aram reflect the complexities of relationships between various Semitic tribes and the larger kingdoms that surrounded them, including Elam. Throughout the time of the patriarchs, Elam's role in the region was also marked by cultural and economic exchanges with other peoples. As the Elamites engaged with the Semitic tribes of the West, they influenced the cultural and material life of the region. The Elamites, known for their distinct language, art, and architecture, had close interactions with their neighbors in Mesopotamia, including the Akkadians, Sumerians, and later, the Babylonians. These interactions created a shared cultural milieu in which the Semitic peoples of the Bible lived and interacted, whether through trade, warfare, or diplomatic relations. Though the biblical narrative is often focused on the interactions between the descendants of Abraham and their immediate neighbors, the presence of powerful kingdoms like Elam in the background was undeniable. Their influence shaped the events of the patriarchal era, as the Elamites played a role in the larger mosaic of ancient Near Eastern history. The legacy of Elam during the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob may not be as prominent in the biblical account, but it remains clear that this kingdom was a vital part of the ancient world, contributing to the geopolitical tensions and cultural exchanges that defined the era. In the book of Isaiah, Elam is depicted not as a distant power of the past, but as a kingdom facing divine judgment. The prophet Isaiah, in his sweeping prophecies against the nations, singles out Elam for its impending destruction. This pronouncement comes in the context of a larger theme of God's sovereignty over the nations and his righteous judgment upon those who oppose his will. Elam's fate, according to Isaiah, is tied to the broader narrative of God's justice being meted out to the proud and the wicked, irrespective of their power or position in the world. Isaiah's prophecy regarding Elam, found in chapter 21, is a grim one. The prophet speaks of a time when Elam, once a prominent force in the ancient world, will face a devastating attack. This message, like many others in the book of Isaiah, emphasizes the temporary nature of worldly power and the ultimate triumph of God's will. The destruction of Elam is depicted as a necessary act, a part of the broader divine plan to bring judgment upon all nations that have turned away from righteousness. The Elamites, like the other nations in Isaiah's prophecies, are not exempt from the judgment that awaits those who disregard God's commands. In their case, their downfall would be brought about by a coalition of nations, signifying that Elam's might had been undermined, and that no kingdom, no matter how powerful, could withstand the righteous wrath of God. The significance of Elam in the context of God's judgment lies in its role as a representative of the broader human tendency to turn away from divine law. Elam, like many of the nations mentioned in Isaiah's prophecies, had once held a place of prominence in the ancient world, yet its pride and arrogance led it to ignore the ways of God. Isaiah's words serve as a reminder to all nations that their power is not inherent, but rather a gift from God, to be used in accordance with His will. When nations become corrupt, relying on their own strength rather than recognizing their dependence on God, they bring upon themselves the inevitable consequences of their actions. Elam's judgment is also a reflection of the broader theme of the nation's involvement in God's plan for Israel. While many of the prophetic judgments in Isaiah focus on the destruction of Israel's enemies, the message is universal. All nations are accountable to God. This theme runs throughout Isaiah's prophecies, which are not only a warning to Israel but also to the world. The fall of Elam, like the fall of Babylon and other kingdoms, underscores the transient nature of earthly kingdoms and the eternal nature of God's justice. For the people of Israel, this was a powerful reminder that their own redemption and future restoration were not only contingent on their obedience to God, but also on the judgment of their enemies, who would be held accountable for their actions. Thus, the prophecy of Isaiah regarding Elam serves as a profound statement about the nature of God's judgment. It is not simply about the downfall of a single nation, but rather a part of the cosmic order in which God's righteousness prevails over the forces of evil, no matter where they arise. The destruction of Elam in Isaiah's vision is both a warning and a promise that God's justice will ultimately prevail, and that no nation, however great or powerful, can escape His judgment if it fails to live in accordance with His will. The rise of the Medes and Persians is one of the most pivotal moments in biblical history, marking a shift in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. Their emergence is first notably recognized in the book of Daniel, where the kingdom of Persia is prophesied to succeed Babylon. Daniel's visions and prophecies foretell the fall of the Babylonian Empire, paving the way for the Medes and Persians to take control of the ancient Near East. This shift is not merely political. It is framed in biblical texts as the fulfillment of God's sovereign plan to judge one empire and raise up another. The Medo-Persian Empire, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, would play a critical role in the unfolding story of God's people and the larger destiny of the nations. In the book of Daniel, the Medes and Persians appear as the second kingdom in a series of empires that Daniel sees in his famous vision of the statue. The statue, made of various materials, gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, represents successive empires, each more fragile than the one before. The chest and arms of silver represent the Medo-Persian Empire, which is to rise after the fall of Babylon. This kingdom's strength is reflected in its dual nature. The Medes and Persians were once two distinct peoples, yet their union formed a powerful force capable of overthrowing the mighty Babylonian Empire. The Bible, particularly in the book of Daniel, portrays their rise as part of the divine narrative, where God uses even the most powerful earthly rulers to fulfill His purposes. The Medo-Persian conquest of Babylon, led by Cyrus the Great, is a turning point in biblical history. In Daniel 5, the writing on the wall foreshadows the fall of the Babylonian Empire, which happens that very night. The Bible recounts the events of Belshazzar's feast, where the drunken king ignores the sacred vessels taken from the temple of God, and the sudden appearance of the mysterious writing on the wall. The message declares that the days of Babylon are numbered, and that the kingdom has been weighed and found wanting. This prophecy is swiftly fulfilled as the Persians, under the command of Cyrus, divert the Euphrates River and enter the city of Babylon. The empire, which once seemed indomitable, falls to a new force, ushering in the reign of the Medes and Persians. This overthrow of Babylon is significant not only for its historical impact but also for its theological implications. The Bible portrays the rise of the Medes and Persians as an act of divine judgment upon Babylon, which had been responsible for the exile of the Israelites and the destruction of the temple. Through Cyrus, God fulfills his promise to bring an end to Babylonian oppression. In Isaiah 45, God even calls Cyrus his anointed, a title that reflects God's sovereign use of this Persian king to accomplish his purposes. The Medo-Persian Empire's rise, then, is framed as both a judgment on Babylon and a providential act in the restoration of God's people, as Cyrus eventually allows the Israelites to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Thus, the rise of the Medes and Persians is a momentous event in biblical history, not only for the political change it brought, but for its deep theological significance. It signifies the fulfillment of prophecy, the execution of divine judgment, and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of God's covenant with his people. In the book of Daniel, the Persian Empire is depicted through a series of vivid and symbolic visions, each revealing not only the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms but also their relation to the kingdom of God. Daniel, known for his wisdom and prophetic insight, receives visions that unfold the future of empires, with particular focus on the Persian Empire's role in God's divine plan. These visions transcend mere political history, offering a deeper theological understanding of how God orchestrates the destiny of nations, using them as instruments of his judgment and mercy. Daniel's visions are integral to understanding the shift from Babylonian dominance to Persian rule, which aligns with the broader biblical narrative of God's sovereignty over human history. One of the most significant prophecies regarding the Persian Empire is found in Daniel 8, where Daniel has a vision of a ram and a he-goat. In this vision, the ram, symbolizing the Medo-Persian Empire, has two horns, one higher than the other, representing the Medes and the Persians. The ram is depicted as pushing westward, northward, and southward, conquering all that it encounters. This image represents the territorial expansion of the Medo-Persian Empire under the rule of kings like Cyrus and Darius, who not only defeated Babylon but also expanded their empire into the lands of Egypt, Asia Minor, and beyond. The ram's power is a direct reflection of the unity of the Medes and Persians, with the higher horn symbolizing the Persian dominance over the Medes. This empire, though formidable, is ultimately destined to be overtaken by another, as Daniel's vision progresses. The he-goat, representing the Greek Empire, emerges in the vision and strikes the ram, defeating it decisively. This act of conquest, however, is not merely historical but prophetic, signaling the eventual rise of Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. The ram's defeat by the he-goat serves as a clear indication of the eventual fall of the Persian Empire, which would be supplanted by the Greeks, as foretold in the vision. Yet, this prophecy is not solely concerned with earthly empires. It points toward the greater spiritual conflict between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of God. The vision of the ram and the he-goat encapsulates the cyclical nature of empires rising and falling according to God's will and emphasizes the transient nature of human power. Daniel's interpretation of these visions highlights the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. While the Persian Empire plays a significant role in God's plan, it is clear that it is not the final kingdom. The vision underscores that all empires, regardless of their power and influence, are subject to God's sovereignty. In the end, the kingdom of God will prevail over all earthly powers. The Persian Empire, though an instrument in God's judgment and a facilitator of the return of the Israelites to their land, will eventually give way to another empire, and the cycle of history will continue. Yet, in the midst of these shifting kingdoms, the prophecy offers hope, pointing to the eternal reign of God's kingdom, which will never be overthrown. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, emerges in the Bible not only as a historical figure but also as a divine instrument in God's plan. Though he was not an Israelite, the scriptures refer to him in remarkable terms, calling him God's anointed one, a title usually reserved for Israel's kings and prophets. This designation is seen in the prophetic writings of Isaiah, where the Persian king is explicitly named as one chosen by God to fulfill a specific purpose. Despite his pagan background, Cyrus is portrayed as an agent of God's will, demonstrating how God can use even foreign rulers to achieve his purposes on earth. In Isaiah 45, God addresses Cyrus directly, declaring, "I have raised you up for the sake of my servant Jacob." This statement reveals the remarkable role Cyrus plays in God's plan for the Jewish people. The prophecy foretells that Cyrus would conquer Babylon, overthrowing the oppressive empire that had exiled the Israelites. In doing so, Cyrus not only brings a military victory but also a spiritual one, as his reign marks the end of Israel's captivity and the beginning of their return to their homeland. The very act of Cyrus's rise to power is portrayed as an act of divine intervention, aligning with the broader biblical theme of God raising and removing kings according to his will. Cyrus's role extends beyond military conquest. He is the one who fulfills God's promise to the Israelites, giving the decree for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. In the book of Ezra, we read how Cyrus, in his first year as king of Persia, issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to their land and rebuild the temple. This decree, as recorded in Ezra 1:2-4, is remarkable not just for its historical significance, but also for its spiritual importance. God had promised the Israelites that their exile would not last forever, and Cyrus's actions serve as the fulfillment of that promise. The rebuilding of the temple symbolizes the restoration of Israel's covenant relationship with God, and Cyrus, though a foreign king, plays a pivotal role in this restoration. Cyrus's decree to rebuild the temple reflects the larger biblical narrative of God's sovereignty over all nations. While the Persian Empire might have been a powerful political entity, its role in God's plan was not solely for conquest and expansion. It was also a means through which God would restore his people. The Persian king's decree, given not out of personal devotion but as part of a divine strategy, serves as a testament to God's ability to work through unexpected means to accomplish his purposes. Thus, Cyrus stands as a figure who bridges the gap between God's judgment on Israel and his mercy in restoring them. His actions fulfill the prophecies of Isaiah, making him an unlikely but significant figure in the unfolding story of God's people. In the biblical narrative, Cyrus is not merely a historical conqueror, but a divinely appointed leader whose role was essential in the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Through him, God shows that his plans transcend the borders of Israel, using even foreign rulers to bring about his will on earth. The Persian Empire played a pivotal role in the return of the Jewish people from their Babylonian exile, fulfilling a promise of restoration that had been long anticipated by the Israelites. After nearly 70 years of captivity, the Jews found themselves under the rule of a new and more favorable power, Persia. The fall of Babylon to King Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE marked the beginning of a significant shift in the fortunes of the Jewish people. Unlike the Babylonians, who had exiled the Israelites and destroyed their temple, the Persians, under Cyrus's leadership, offered a decree that allowed the Jews to return to their land and rebuild what had been lost. Cyrus's decree, recorded in the book of Ezra, was a remarkable act of providence. Though a foreign king and not a follower of Israel's God, Cyrus recognized the importance of the Jewish people's return to their land and the rebuilding of their sacred temple. His declaration was more than just a political move. It was a fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah had spoken of Cyrus long before his birth, calling him God's anointed one. The very act of allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem was seen as the fulfillment of God's promise to restore his people after their long period of suffering. In this way, Persia became the instrument through which God's restoration plan was carried out. The significance of Persian patronage cannot be overstated. Under the reign of King Darius I, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem gained further royal support. The Persian kings not only allowed the Israelites to return to their homeland, but also provided them with the resources necessary to restore the heart of their religious life, the temple. The Persian kings, aware of the political and religious importance of the Jewish return, granted funds and materials for the reconstruction. They also ensured that the returning exiles had the freedom to worship according to their traditions without interference, something that had been denied under Babylonian rule. This patronage extended beyond material support. The Persian Empire, with its vast bureaucracy and systems of governance, provided a stable environment for the Jewish people to rebuild their community and their faith. The Israelites were able to establish their worship in a way that was consistent with their traditions, guided by the leadership of figures like Zerubbabel and Ezra, who were supported by the Persian kings. The rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple was not just an act of restoration but also a statement of the Jewish people's resilience and divine favor. Persian patronage, therefore, was a critical factor in the Jewish return from exile. It allowed the Israelites to rebuild their physical and spiritual home and to reaffirm their identity as a people chosen by God. The Persian Empire, though an external power, became a key player in the divine plan for the restoration of Israel, helping to fulfill prophecies of return and rebuilding. The support given by the Persians was a tangible manifestation of God's faithfulness to his promises, and it set the stage for the continuation of the Jewish story, marked by the rebuilding of their temple and the reaffirmation of their covenant with God. The story of Queen Esther, unfolding within the Persian Empire, is one of profound significance in Jewish history. Set against the backdrop of the Persian court, it highlights the courage and faith of a young Jewish woman who, through God's providence, became the key figure in the salvation of her people. Esther, an orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, was chosen to be the queen of King Xerxes, a powerful ruler of Persia. Her rise to prominence in the royal court was no accident, but a part of a divine plan that would shape the future of the Jewish people. The events in the Book of Esther are centered around the malicious plot of Haman, the king's chief advisor, who sought the annihilation of all Jews within the Persian Empire. Haman's hatred for Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who refused to bow to him, led him to devise a scheme to destroy every Jew in the empire. With the king's unwitting approval, Haman set in motion a decree that would lead to the slaughter of the Jewish people. The fate of the Jews seemed sealed, and all hope appeared lost. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, Esther's courage and wisdom shone brightly. Despite the risks to her own life, as approaching the king without being summoned was punishable by death, Esther revealed her Jewish identity to Xerxes. She pleaded for the lives of her people, exposing Haman's treachery. This courageous act was not just a personal risk, but a moment of divine timing. Esther's position as queen, her relationship with the king, and her boldness in speaking out allowed her to turn the tide of history. The king, moved by her appeal, had Haman executed and issued a decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. The salvation of the Jews was nothing short of miraculous, a powerful testament to God's providence. Though the name of God is never explicitly mentioned in the Book of Esther, his hand is evident throughout the narrative. The timing of Esther's rise to the throne, her divine favor with the king, and the eventual downfall of Haman all point to a sovereign God working behind the scenes. The victory over Haman, once thought of as an insurmountable foe, became a symbol of the Jewish people's enduring faith and resilience. The story of Esther not only highlights God's providential care, but also underscores the importance of courage and faith in times of peril. Esther's willingness to risk her life for the sake of her people became a defining moment in Jewish history. Her actions led to the establishment of the festival of Purim, a time of celebration and remembrance of God's deliverance. The events in Esther serve as a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable evil, God's plans prevail, and His people are never abandoned. Under the rule of the Persian Empire, the Jewish people were given a unique opportunity to return to their ancestral homeland and rebuild what had been destroyed during the Babylonian exile. The Persian kings, particularly Cyrus the Great and Artaxerxes, played a significant role in this restoration, not only allowing the Jews to return but actively supporting their efforts. This support, both material and political, was instrumental in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its walls, a key symbol of Jewish restoration. Ezra and Nehemiah, two central figures in this period, were pivotal in the spiritual and physical renewal of the Jewish people. Ezra, a scribe and priest, was entrusted with the task of leading a group of exiles back to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes' reign. The king provided Ezra with letters of protection and permission to take valuable resources for the rebuilding of the temple. Ezra's mission was not just to restore the physical structure of the temple, but to restore the Jewish people's commitment to God's laws and covenant. His leadership was instrumental in the spiritual renewal of the Jewish community. Ezra's reading of the law in the public square, along with his reforms, helped to re-establish the Torah as the central guide for the people of Israel. He led the people in confessing their sins and renewing their covenant with God, ensuring that the spiritual foundation of the community was as strong as its physical restoration. Nehemiah, serving as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, had a different role. When Nehemiah learned of the dire condition of Jerusalem's walls, he sought permission from the king to return to his homeland to oversee the rebuilding. With the king's blessing, Nehemiah set out for Jerusalem with a vision to restore not only the city's walls but also its social and political structure. Nehemiah's leadership was marked by his ability to organize the people and rally them toward a common goal, overcoming opposition from neighboring enemies and internal discord. The rebuilding of the walls was a physical representation of the Jewish people's resilience and God's faithfulness. It also symbolized the protection and security of the Jewish community, both spiritually and politically. The support of the Persian kings was a key element in the success of these endeavors. The kings of Persia not only allowed the Jews to return to their land, but also provided the necessary resources and protection. This was a fulfillment of the prophecy that God would use a foreign king, Cyrus, to bring about the restoration of his people. The Persian Empire, in supporting the rebuilding of Jerusalem, played a significant role in the continued existence of the Jewish people. Ezra's religious reforms and Nehemiah's physical restoration of the city were both a testament to the power of Persian patronage and the hand of God in fulfilling His promises to Israel. The Persian Empire, with its vast territories and powerful influence, stands as a testament to God's sovereignty over the affairs of nations. As history unfolded, the rise and fall of empires was never a matter of mere chance or human ambition. Throughout the biblical narrative, it becomes clear that God, in His infinite wisdom, orchestrated the rise of empires for His divine purposes. Persia's prominence in the ancient world was no exception, and its role in the history of Israel serves as a powerful reminder of God's hand in the unfolding of His plan for His people. The Persian Empire's ascendancy began with the reign of Cyrus the Great, whose conquests unified a vast region that spanned from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. However, it was not by Cyrus's own power or by the strength of his armies that Persia rose to dominance, but by God's providence. In the book of Isaiah, God calls Cyrus His anointed one, despite Cyrus not knowing the Lord. Through the Persian king, God fulfilled His promise to deliver the Jewish people from their Babylonian exile and allow them to return to their land. This act was a manifestation of God's sovereignty, showing that even a pagan king could be used by God to bring about His purposes. In this way, Persia became an instrument in God's plan for Israel, a temporary ally chosen by God to facilitate the restoration of the Jewish people. The biblical narrative repeatedly emphasizes that God is not only the ruler of Israel but of all nations. The rise of Persia, like that of the Babylonians before it and the Greeks and Romans afterward, was ordained by God. In the book of Daniel, The succession of empires is symbolized through visions that illustrate how God's kingdom will ultimately outlast all earthly kingdoms. The Persian Empire, while mighty in its own right, is portrayed as a temporary vessel for the fulfillment of God's larger purpose for Israel. It was under Persian rule that the Jewish people were able to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, restore their religious practices, and return to their land. All these events were woven into the divine narrative of redemption that would culminate in the coming of the Messiah. Yet, Persia's dominance was not everlasting. Just as the rise of the Persian Empire was part of God's plan, so too was its eventual fall. The Persian Empire, like all empires, would eventually give way to another, in this case, the Greeks under Alexander the Great. This cycle of empires, each rising to prominence only to be succeeded by another, reveals the transitory nature of human kingdoms and the eternal nature of God's reign. In His sovereignty, God allows earthly powers to rise and fall, using them to accomplish His will in the world. Persia's place in this divine plan was critical but temporary, serving as a means by which God restored His people and prepared them for the next phase of His redemptive work. Ultimately, the story of Persia's role in the Bible is a story of God's control over history. It serves as a reminder that no empire, however mighty, can thwart God's eternal plan. Persia's place in God's plan for Israel is a testimony to the Lord's ability to use even the most unexpected means to fulfill His promises and guide His people toward their ultimate redemption. The rise of Alexander the Great marked a significant turning point in the history of empires, bringing an end to the vast and powerful Persian Empire. With swift and calculated military campaigns, Alexander conquered the Persian territories, solidifying his place as one of history's greatest conquerors. His invasion of Persia was not just a military victory, but also a fulfillment of prophetic visions seen by the prophet Daniel, signaling a major shift in the balance of power in the ancient world. As Alexander advanced eastward, his army swept through the heart of Persia, defeating King Darius III in a series of decisive battles, most notably at the Battle of Gaugamela. The fall of Persia, once a dominant empire with immense territorial reach, marked the end of an era. Persian influence, which had endured for centuries, crumbled under Alexander's relentless march, and with it, the Persian kings were dethroned. The empire that had been the instrument of God's will in the restoration of Israel now fell into the hands of the Greeks, and the power structure of the ancient world was irrevocably altered. Biblical prophecy had already foretold this dramatic change. In the book of Daniel, the prophet Daniel had a vision of 4 beasts representing successive empires. The Persian Empire was symbolized by a ram, but it was destined to be replaced by the next empire, symbolized by a male goat. This male goat, which was destined to overthrow the ram, was a direct reference to Greece under the leadership of Alexander. Daniel's prophecy about the shifting of power from Persia to Greece foreshadowed the very events that would unfold centuries later, as Alexander's conquest brought about the end of Persian dominance. The conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great was more than just a military event. It was a divine transition that fulfilled God's plan for the course of history. The power dynamics in the ancient world shifted once again, as Greece became the new dominant force. This marked the beginning of the Hellenistic era, an age where Greek culture and influence spread far and wide, changing the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the known world. For the Jewish people, the fall of Persia had significant implications. Under Persian rule, they had enjoyed relative freedom and support, particularly in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the Temple. However, with the rise of the Greek Empire, new challenges arose. The Hellenistic influence brought with it cultural and religious tensions, as Greek customs and philosophies began to infiltrate the lands once ruled by Persia. This marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Jewish people, one that would see the introduction of Greek culture into the ancient Jewish world, leading to the eventual struggles seen in the Maccabean Revolt. The end of Persian rule and the rise of Greece in biblical prophecy reflect the transient nature of earthly kingdoms. Just as God had raised the Persian Empire for His purpose, so too did he allow its fall to make way for another empire. Alexander's conquest was not just a historical event but a fulfillment of divine prophecy, reminding us that God is sovereign over all nations, guiding history according to his eternal plan. The Maccabean Revolt stands as one of the most defining moments in Jewish history, marking the end of an era of Persian influence and the rise of Hellenistic rule in the region. By the time the revolt began in the 2nd century BCE, the Persian Empire had long since fallen to the Greeks under Alexander the Great. However, the lingering effects of Persian governance and the historical ties between Persia and the Jewish people continued to play a role in shaping the unfolding events. The Maccabean Revolt was not only a struggle for religious freedom but also a final confrontation between the remnants of Persian influence and the increasingly dominant Greek powers. During the time leading up to the revolt, Persia's influence had waned, leaving the Jewish people to contend with the expanding reach of Greek rulers. The Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic kingdom that emerged from the division of Alexander's empire, ruled over Judea, but their harsh treatment of the Jewish people set the stage for revolt. The Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, imposed measures that desecrated the Jewish faith, most notably the outlawing of Jewish religious practices and the defiling of the temple in Jerusalem. The heavy-handed approach of the Greek rulers, however, was met with fierce resistance from the Jewish people. The Maccabees, a family of Jewish priests, led the revolt, fueled by their desire to restore the faith and the traditions that had been compromised by foreign influence. Despite the fact that Persian rule had ended centuries earlier, the memory of Persian support for Jewish autonomy during the exile lingered. The Maccabean struggle, in part, represented the last vestiges of Persian influence, both in terms of their religious tolerance and their capacity for supporting Jewish freedom. The Seleucids, much like their Persian predecessors, found themselves engaged in internal conflicts, which allowed the Maccabean leaders to gain ground and eventually reclaim control of Jerusalem. While Persia itself was no longer a direct player in the events of the Maccabean Revolt, its legacy lived on in the way the Jewish people viewed the role of foreign powers. Under Persian rule, the Jews had experienced relative peace, a chance to rebuild their city and their faith. With the Seleucid Greeks, however, the Maccabees saw a new kind of foreign oppression that sought to erase Jewish identity, much as the earlier Greek rulers had sought to erase the Persian influence in their domain. The success of the Maccabean Revolt, which led to the rededication of the temple and the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, symbolized a brief return to Jewish independence, but it also marked the end of the Persian era. The lingering power of Persia, once a dominant force in the region, had faded into history, and the Jewish people were left to contend with a new wave of Greek influence. Still, the Maccabean Revolt reminded the Jewish people of the importance of their faith and their resilience in the face of foreign oppression, a legacy that would endure long after the fall of the Persian Empire. The Book of Daniel provides a vivid narrative of prophecy that spans across kingdoms and empires, offering insight into God's sovereign control over history. Among the significant themes in Daniel are the prophecies surrounding the Persian kings, whose reigns were intertwined with the unfolding divine plan for Israel. As Daniel served under Babylonian rule, he was also present as the Persian Empire began to rise, and the prophecies in his book reflect this transition from one great empire to the next. Darius the Mede, whose reign is mentioned in the opening chapters of Daniel, is a somewhat enigmatic figure. While historical records about him are scant, Daniel presents him as a pivotal figure in the transition of power from Babylon to Persia. Darius the Mede is often associated with the fall of Babylon, as the city was conquered by the Persians under King Cyrus the Great. Darius, serving as the governor of Babylon, is credited with establishing order in the aftermath of the conquest. His brief reign is significant, not only because of his leadership during this critical moment in history, but also because he represents a key fulfillment of Daniel's visions of the rise and fall of empires. Darius's role in the story of Daniel is particularly highlighted in the infamous account of Daniel in the lion's den, where his decree to have Daniel thrown into the lion's den symbolizes the struggle between divine law and earthly power. Following Darius, the Persian king Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus in the Bible, looms large in both biblical history and prophecy. Xerxes is perhaps best known for his role in the Book of Esther, where his actions unwittingly become part of God's providence in the salvation of the Jewish people. His reign marked a period of great power and wealth for Persia, and yet, as depicted in the scriptures, he was ultimately a tool in God's divine plan. The Book of Daniel, while not directly referencing Xerxes, lays the foundation for understanding the kings who followed Darius, especially as they are part of the succession of Persia's power and influence in the ancient world. Daniel's prophecies regarding Persia, particularly the vision of the ram with 2 horns in Daniel 8, underscore the power and importance of these Persian kings. The ram symbolizes the Persian Empire, with the 2 horns representing the dual leadership of Media and Persia, of which Darius and Cyrus were the primary rulers. The significance of these kings is not just in their political and military power, but in their roles as instruments in God's unfolding plan. The prophecies in Daniel offer a picture of Persia as a mighty empire that would rise, conquer, and eventually be replaced, but never without fulfilling its role in the broader narrative of God's judgment and salvation. Through the figures of Darius the Mede and Xerxes, the Book of Daniel paints a portrait of Persian kings as pivotal players in the divine drama, a narrative of conquest and divine sovereignty, where kings rise and fall, but God's ultimate will prevails across all empires. These kings were instruments through which God worked, and their legacies are intertwined with the broader story of God's relationship with Israel and the nations. In the 7th chapter of Daniel, the prophet is granted a vision that encapsulates the rise and fall of empires in a series of symbolic beasts. Among them, the second beast, described as a bear, represents the Persian Empire. This vivid and unsettling imagery offers profound insight into the character and destiny of Persia within God's divine plan. Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts is a highly symbolic depiction of the world powers that would come after Babylon. The bear, which rises on one side, is described as having 3 ribs in its mouth, symbolizing the kingdom's conquests. The interpretation of the bear in this vision aligns with the historical rise of the Persian Empire, which emerged as a powerful force following the downfall of Babylon. The uneven posture of the bear, rising on one side, speaks to the nature of Persia's dual heritage, consisting of both the Medes and the Persians. The Medes, initially the dominant power, were gradually subsumed by the Persians, as the latter grew in strength, uniting the two into one formidable empire. The 3 ribs in the bear's mouth symbolize the 3 major conquests that Persia achieved in its early expansion: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, which marked the apex of Persian territorial growth. The symbolic nature of the bear reveals much about the Persian Empire's characteristics. It was a kingdom that, much like a bear, was powerful and capable of dominating its enemies, but also one that consumed much in its rise. The bear's insatiable hunger mirrors the way in which the Persian Empire expanded, devouring nations and peoples in its quest for supremacy. The act of the bear devouring much flesh is an image that reflects the Persian Empire's tendency to conquer vast swaths of territory, leaving destruction in its wake. This is further illustrated by the bear's posture, which suggests an empire not just driven by ambition, but one that was unstoppable once it began to conquer. However, the symbolism also carries with it prophetic overtones. Persia, as represented by the bear, was not an empire that would last forever. Like the other beasts in the vision, it was destined to fall, making way for the next world power. The bear's rise to dominance was followed by the rise of a leopard, which is interpreted as representing Greece. The brief but notable period of Persian dominance would be overshadowed by the faster, more agile conquests of Alexander the Great. In prophetic terms, Persia's depiction as the bear serves as a reminder of the transient nature of worldly powers. Despite its might and territorial conquests, the Persian Empire, like all the empires represented in Daniel's vision, was a part of God's broader plan, a plan that would ultimately bring all earthly kingdoms to an end. Persia's role was pivotal, but it was always temporary, serving as a bridge between Babylonian power and the eventual coming of the Greek Empire. Through this vision, Daniel not only forecasts the rise and fall of empires but underscores God's ultimate sovereignty over the course of history, where every kingdom, no matter how mighty, is subject to his will. The Persian Empire, under the reign of Cyrus the Great and his successors, had a profound influence on Israel, both in its policies and in the way it interacted with the Jewish people. Persia, unlike many empires of the ancient world, took a remarkably different approach to its conquered peoples. Rather than imposing harsh rule and subjugating the nations it dominated, the Persians, especially under Cyrus, allowed a significant degree of autonomy, which had a lasting impact on Israel's recovery from the Babylonian exile. When Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he immediately issued a decree that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their land and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. This decree, recorded in the Book of Ezra, is a significant moment in Jewish history. It marked the end of a period of displacement and persecution that had lasted for several generations. Cyrus's policy toward Israel was not one of forced assimilation or oppression, but rather a return to their homeland with the freedom to practice their religion and rebuild their sacred spaces. This is seen in the biblical portrayal of Cyrus as an instrument of God, fulfilling prophecies made centuries earlier by Isaiah, who called Cyrus God's anointed one. While the Persian approach to Israel was, on the surface, benevolent, it was not without its complexities. The ethical questions surrounding Persian rule center on the implications of their patronage. Though the Persian Empire allowed the Jewish people to return and rebuild, they still controlled the region and maintained a presence of Persian officials in Jerusalem. The Jews, while free to rebuild, were still subject to the overarching rule of Persia. This could be seen as a form of political subjugation, where their autonomy was limited by the imperial structures Persia put in place. The Jewish people were allowed to practice their faith, but they were still ultimately subjects of a foreign power. Additionally, the impact of Persian rule on the Jewish people must be understood in the broader context of the empire's treatment of other nations. Persia's policy was generally one of tolerance and respect for local customs and religions, which was a marked contrast to the more aggressive assimilationist policies of other empires, like Babylon. However, this tolerance came with the cost of submission to Persian authority. The Israelites, now back in their land, had to balance their religious and cultural autonomy with the reality of living under Persian oversight. For many Israelites, this tension likely raised difficult questions about their identity and their relationship with God. Were they truly free if they were still under the control of an empire? Could they maintain their spiritual integrity while living under the rule of a foreign power? These questions echoed in the post-exilic period, as the Jewish community sought to rebuild not only their city and temple but also their spiritual and cultural identity. Despite these ethical concerns, the Persian Empire played a critical role in preserving the Jewish people and their faith. Persia's policies allowed the Jews to survive the trauma of exile and to rebuild their community in ways that would later set the stage for the coming of the Messiah. The return to the land and the rebuilding of the temple under Persian rule were foundational moments in the history of Israel, making the Persian Empire, despite its complexities, a crucial player in the fulfillment of God's promises to his people. In the book of Isaiah, the fall of Persia is intertwined with the prophecy of the fall of Babylon, a powerful moment that would shape the trajectory of Israel's history. Isaiah 13 contains a vivid and foreboding prophecy regarding the downfall of Babylon, a prophecy that extends its implications to Persia as well, as the Persian Empire would ultimately bring Babylon to its knees. Isaiah's writings, though set in a time of Assyrian dominance, spoke to future events that would later resonate through the rise and fall of empires, including Persia. Isaiah 13 begins with a dire declaration against Babylon, a city that epitomized the might and arrogance of imperial power. In the prophecy, Isaiah paints a picture of destruction so total that it seems to echo the divine retribution for human pride and injustice. The Lord will destroy the glory of the Babylonian pride, Isaiah prophesies, a statement that would be fulfilled when the Medo-Persian coalition, under Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon in 539 BC. Though Persia was the instrument of this divine judgment, the prophecy also carries deeper theological implications that reverberated through the history of Israel and the surrounding nations. The connection between the prophecy of Babylon's fall and Persia's rise is significant. Persia's role in history was not just that of a conqueror, but also as the instrument through which God would fulfill his promises to Israel. The fall of Babylon, foretold by Isaiah, paved the way for the liberation of the Jewish people from exile and their return to Jerusalem. But in the prophetic vision, Babylon was not the only empire to face the consequences of divine judgment. Persia, despite being the deliverer of Israel, was not exempt from the broader theological message of Isaiah's prophecy. All empires, no matter how mighty or benevolent, ultimately answer to God's sovereignty. Isaiah's words resonated through Israel's collective memory as the Jewish people considered the shifting tides of power and the rise of new empires. In the wake of Persia's fall to Greece, the theological understanding of Persia's role in the unfolding story of Israel became clearer. Persia, though acting as a liberator for a time, was still part of the divine cycle of empires that rose and fell according to God's greater plan. Persia's fall, as prophesied in Isaiah, symbolized the impermanence of earthly power, a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast or seemingly invincible, is beyond God's control. The prophecy in Isaiah 13 also offers a deeper insight into the nature of God's judgment. It is not a random or capricious judgment, but one that operates on a moral and spiritual basis. Persia, like Babylon before it, would face the consequences of its own pride and excess, despite its temporary role as a tool for Israel's restoration. The historical events that followed the rise of Greece, the eventual fall of Persia, and the spread of Greek culture were seen through the lens of Isaiah's prophecy as a testament to the sovereignty of God over all human affairs and the reminder that the nations are but instruments in the fulfillment of divine purposes. Thus, the prophecy in Isaiah 13 regarding the fall of Babylon and Persia shaped the historical and theological understanding of Persia's role in Israel's story. While Persia's kings, especially Cyrus, were hailed as instruments of God's plan for Israel, Isaiah's prophecy reminded the people of Israel, and indeed, all nations, that God's judgment is inevitable and impartial, and that all empires, no matter how powerful, ultimately must answer to his sovereignty. In the prophecies of Jeremiah, Persia plays a crucial role as both a tool of judgment and an agent of divine justice, reflecting God's sovereignty over the rise and fall of nations. While Jeremiah's message largely concerns the impending destruction of Judah due to its rebellion, he also foretells the rise of Persia and its role in executing God's judgment upon the people of Israel. In his prophecies, Jeremiah paints a complex portrait of Persia, portraying it as an instrument of God's will, an empire that would be used to bring about divine retribution, but one that would also face its own reckoning. Jeremiah's references to Persia appear in the context of warnings against Judah's disobedience and the broader judgment coming upon the nations. In Jeremiah 25, God instructs the prophet to deliver a message to all the nations, warning them of the coming of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and the eventual rise of Persia. While Babylon is the immediate threat to Judah, Jeremiah makes it clear that Persia will be the instrument through which God executes his plan, ultimately leading to the fall of Babylon itself. Jeremiah 25:9 states, "Behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants. I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it, everything written in this book." In this passage, Babylon is depicted as God's servant, carrying out his will, but it is the future coming of Persia that shifts the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The use of the term "my servant" regarding Nebuchadnezzar can be seen as God's control over even those who do not acknowledge him. This divine manipulation of empires underscores the central theme of God's sovereignty, where even a foreign empire, such as Babylon, serves God's purpose in his judgment against Israel. Yet, Persia is presented not just as a temporary instrument but as part of God's grand plan, fulfilling the prophetic promises of Israel's restoration after their time of exile. Jeremiah also emphasizes the transient nature of Persia's role in God's judgment. In Jeremiah 51, the fall of Babylon is prophesied, and it is Persia, under Cyrus, that will rise to overthrow the Babylonians. Jeremiah 51:11 states, "Sharpen the arrows, take up the shields. The Lord has stirred up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, because his purpose concerning Babylon is to destroy it." Here, the Medes, closely associated with the rise of Persia, are portrayed as instruments of God's judgment, reflecting his will for the destruction of Babylon, the oppressive empire that had held Israel captive. However, Jeremiah's prophecies also reflect a deeper theological understanding. While Persia is used to punish the nations, including Babylon, it does not escape the divine plan for judgment. Just as Persia was raised up to serve God's justice, so too will it eventually face divine reckoning for its own pride and actions. This is a theme that runs through Jeremiah's oracles. The nations rise and fall according to God's will, and though they may be used as tools for judgment, they are not exempt from God's judgment themselves. In the end, Persia's role in Jeremiah's prophecies serves as a reminder that the empires of the world, whether they are instruments of judgment or agents of oppression, exist within the framework of God's larger plan. Persia, as much as any other empire, was part of God's sovereign will, a tool to fulfill divine purposes, but also subject to the consequences of its own actions in the grand scheme of God's justice. The fall of Babylon to the Persians under King Cyrus is one of the most dramatic and pivotal moments in biblical history, marking the end of an era and the fulfillment of prophecy. In the book of Daniel, the prophecy regarding the demise of Babylon is made clear long before the event took place. It is in Daniel 5, during the reign of King Belshazzar, that we see the writing on the wall, a divine message that foretells the fall of Babylon and its transfer of power to the Medes and Persians. This prophecy is not just a mere foretelling of political change, but a significant event that underscores God's sovereignty over the nations. As the scene unfolds in Daniel 5, Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, holds a lavish banquet in defiance of God, using the sacred vessels from the Temple of Jerusalem. In the midst of his revelry, a mysterious hand appears and writes a message on the wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel, summoned to interpret the writing, reveals the meaning of the cryptic words. Mene means that God has numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that the king has been weighed and found wanting. Peres indicates that the kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, as prophesied, the mighty Babylon falls to Cyrus the Great. The fulfillment of this prophecy is both swift and spectacular. Cyrus, who had been leading the Persian forces, had already conquered the surrounding regions and was now poised to take Babylon. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Cyrus's army diverted the Euphrates River, allowing them to enter the city through the riverbed. This clever strategy, combined with internal strife within Babylon, led to its swift capture. As Belshazzar's reign came to an abrupt end, the prophecy spoken through Daniel was fully realized. The great city of Babylon, once a symbol of strength and dominance, crumbled before the Persian forces, and the kingdom was transferred into new hands. In the biblical narrative, the fall of Babylon is not merely a political event but a sign of divine judgment. Throughout the Old Testament, Babylon had been a source of oppression for Israel, particularly during the exile. The Babylonians had conquered Judah, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and carried the people into captivity. Yet, in the fullness of time, God's judgment on Babylon is brought to pass, and Persia is raised up as the instrument of that judgment. It is through Cyrus, the Persian king, that God's plan for Israel's restoration begins to unfold. Cyrus's role in this grand narrative is significant. The prophet Isaiah had foretold his rise centuries earlier, even calling him God's anointed. In Isaiah 45:1, God addresses Cyrus, saying, "I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron." The Persian king, though not a believer in the God of Israel, is used by God to accomplish his purposes, marking the beginning of the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. The fall of Babylon and the rise of Persia are more than just historical events. They are part of a divine tapestry that highlights God's control over the nations and his faithfulness to his people. The prophecy in Daniel was fulfilled in the most dramatic fashion, serving as a reminder of God's power to bring down the proud and exalt the humble. Through the Persians, God would fulfill his promises to Israel, restoring his people to their land and preparing the way for future redemption. In the book of Daniel, the Medes and Persians are presented not only as a historical force but as a key part of God's sovereign plan. Through Daniel's dreams and visions, the kingdoms that rise and fall in the world are depicted as part of a divine narrative. Among the most notable of these visions is the one Daniel has in chapter 7, where 4 great beasts rise from the sea, each representing a different kingdom. The second beast, which is described as like a bear, is understood to symbolize the Medo-Persian Empire. This vision, while rooted in the events of the ancient world, carries profound theological significance, blending both history and divine prophecy. Daniel's portrayal of the Medes and Persians in his dreams underscores their role in the larger cosmic drama. In his vision of the 4 beasts, the bear represents a kingdom that will conquer with a ferocious hunger, consuming nations. The empire is symbolized by the bear's posture, with 3 ribs in its mouth, suggesting its conquest of 3 major powers: Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. The imagery of the bear, both strong and uneven, hints at the dual nature of the Medo-Persian Empire formed through the union of the Medes and the Persians, 2 peoples who, although powerful, were distinct from one another. This division, however, was not without purpose. The Medes and Persians were brought together by God's will to fulfill his divine plan. Through this blending of 2 nations, God would bring judgment upon Babylon and begin the restoration of Israel. Further in the book, the Persian Empire is symbolized by the ram in Daniel's vision, chapter 8, which is charging westward and northward and southward. This ram represents the power and reach of Persia, extending its rule far and wide across the ancient world. The 2 horns of the ram are specifically highlighted, one being higher than the other, representing the rise of the Persian Empire after the Medes. While these symbols have clear historical implications, they also reflect a larger, theological truth that God raises up and brings down rulers according to his will. The rise of the Medes and Persians is part of God's ongoing plan to use earthly empires to execute his judgment and to bring about his promises, particularly the restoration of his people Israel. Daniel's dreams and visions also emphasize the temporality of earthly empires, no matter how powerful they seem. As the Medes and Persians are depicted as a transitional empire in God's plan, their reign is seen as a means to an end, paving the way for the coming of the next empire, Greece. The theme of divine sovereignty over the rise and fall of kingdoms is central to the narrative. Even in the might of the Medo-Persian Empire, there is an underlying theological message. God is ultimately in control of history, and he will accomplish his purposes through these unfolding events. In Daniel, the Medes and Persians are not simply a political power. They are a vehicle for God's greater redemptive work. The empire's rise, though marked by military conquest and territorial expansion, is framed within the context of divine justice and restoration. Theologically, the Persian Empire becomes an instrument of God's will, fulfilling the prophecy of judgment against Babylon and setting the stage for the return of the Jewish people to their land. In this way, the historical and theological themes in Daniel are deeply intertwined, illustrating how God uses even the most powerful empires to bring about his plan for humanity's salvation. The role of Persia in the future of Israel holds significant weight in the eschatological narrative found within the Bible. While Persia's historical influence was substantial in the restoration of Israel after the Babylonian exile, its prophetic connection to the end times carries a deeper theological meaning. Several prophetic texts allude to the role Persia will play in the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for Israel, revealing the extent of divine orchestration in the unfolding of history and the destiny of his people. One of the key passages that sheds light on Persia's eschatological role is found in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 38, the prophet speaks of a future invasion of Israel by a coalition of nations led by Gog of Magog. Among these nations is Persia, identified explicitly in verse 5. Here, Persia is mentioned as a significant power in the last days, aligning with other nations in a grand conflict that will challenge the very existence of Israel. This prophecy, often referred to as the War of Gog and Magog, speaks of a time when nations will rise against Israel, but ultimately, God will intervene to protect his people. Persia's inclusion in this prophecy is notable because it marks a shift from its historical role as a protector and supporter of Israel to a nation embroiled in the ultimate conflict surrounding Israel's future. Yet, in the larger context of biblical prophecy, Persia's involvement does not solely highlight its role as an adversary. Other prophecies, such as those found in Isaiah, suggest that Persia will play a part in the restoration of Israel in the final days. In Isaiah 60, a passage that speaks of the glorious future for Israel, the nations will bring their wealth and honor to Jerusalem. Persia, along with other nations, is depicted as a key player in this future time of peace and prosperity for Israel. The mention of Persia in these passages does not merely emphasize military confrontation but reflects a transformation from adversary to benefactor in the divine narrative. This shift underscores the broader biblical theme that God's sovereignty encompasses not only judgment but also mercy, and that even nations once seen as enemies may ultimately serve his redemptive purpose. In the eschatological vision, Persia's role is not just limited to its involvement in end-time conflicts. Rather, it is part of a broader tapestry in which God orchestrates the return of his people to their land, their ultimate restoration, and their reconciliation with the nations. The inclusion of Persia in these prophetic contexts reinforces the idea that God's plan for Israel is comprehensive, involving nations that were once distant or hostile. Persia's involvement in the restoration of Israel in the last days, as foretold in various prophecies, underscores the unbreakable bond between the Jewish people and God's eternal promises. Ultimately, the role of Persia in the future of Israel reveals the enduring power of God's will and purpose. Through both judgment and blessing, Persia's place in the biblical narrative reflects the complexity of God's eschatological plan, one that transcends history and leads to the fulfillment of his promises to Israel in the final redemption. The Persian Empire's influence on Jewish culture and religious practices was profound, especially during the period of exile. When the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, the Jewish people were forcibly removed from their land. Yet their subsequent interactions with the Persian Empire shaped the trajectory of Jewish life in significant ways. The Persians, known for their relative tolerance toward different cultures and religions, allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This act of kindness laid the foundation for much of the Jewish practices and structures that emerged in the post-exilic period. One of the most significant impacts of Persian rule on Jewish culture was the development of the synagogue system. Prior to the exile, Jewish worship was primarily centered around the temple in Jerusalem. However, the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians and the subsequent exile necessitated new forms of worship and communal gathering. The Persians, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, encouraged the Jewish people to maintain their religious practices, but they also facilitated the establishment of local places of worship and study, laying the groundwork for the synagogue system. Synagogues became places not only of prayer but also of learning, where Jewish communities could gather to read the Torah, study scripture, and discuss religious teachings. This shift in worship practices was crucial to the survival and continuity of Jewish faith during the exile and beyond. Under Persian rule, the Jewish people also became more organized in their religious observance. The idea of community-based worship, centered in synagogues, provided an alternative to the centralized worship in the temple, which was no longer accessible. Jewish life, therefore, evolved to become more focused on the home and the local community, with synagogues serving as the hub for religious instruction, social life, and the preservation of Jewish identity. This period marked the rise of Jewish communal leadership, including the roles of scribes and rabbis, who became instrumental in guiding the people through the complexities of maintaining their faith in a foreign land. Moreover, the Persian period influenced the way Jewish religious practices were structured. The emphasis on the reading and study of the Torah, as well as the development of religious rituals that could be performed without the temple, was vital. It was during this time that the foundations for many Jewish practices, such as prayers recited in synagogues, the reading of the Torah on the Sabbath, and the celebration of key religious festivals, were solidified. These practices not only helped preserve Jewish religious identity, but also provided a framework for Jewish communities throughout the diaspora in the centuries that followed. In conclusion, the Persian Empire played a pivotal role in shaping Jewish religious life during and after the exile. Through their policies of religious tolerance and support for the Jewish return to their homeland, the Persians facilitated the transformation of Jewish worship practices, leading to the development of the synagogue system and a renewed focus on Torah study. These influences laid the foundation for the Jewish faith's survival and flourishing, despite the absence of the temple, and established patterns of worship and community life that would continue to define Jewish identity for generations to come. In the book of Isaiah, the prophecy regarding the Persian king Cyrus stands as a remarkable testament to the sovereignty and foresight of God. In Isaiah 45, the prophet speaks of a king who would rise from the east and fulfill God's purposes for Israel, long before the birth of Cyrus himself. Isaiah's prophetic declaration, made over 150 years before Cyrus's reign, introduces the king by name, which is a striking feature in the context of ancient prophecy, where names of future rulers were rarely revealed with such clarity. God, through Isaiah, not only foretells the rise of Cyrus but also designates him as an instrument to carry out divine judgment and deliverance. Isaiah's words in this chapter are filled with a sense of awe at the power of God to direct the course of history. God refers to Cyrus as his anointed one, a term usually reserved for Israel's kings, priests, or prophets, signaling the king's special role in God's overarching plan. This designation of Cyrus as anointed emphasizes the notion that God's will can be carried out through unexpected instruments, even through a foreign king who did not worship God in the traditional sense. Cyrus, though a Persian, is depicted as a divinely chosen figure who will play a pivotal role in the restoration of Israel and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The prophecy is not just about the historical event of Cyrus's rise to power, but it also underlines the idea that God is in control of the world's nations and empires. Isaiah speaks of Cyrus's military victories, the opening of gates before him, and the nation's submission to his rule. But more importantly, the prophecy focuses on Cyrus's mission to free Israel from Babylonian captivity. God speaks of Cyrus as the one who will subdue nations, yet his true calling is revealed to be a liberator for the exiled Israelites. This narrative highlights God's ability to use even those outside his covenant people to fulfill his purposes for his chosen nation. The specificity of Isaiah's prophecy is extraordinary. The fact that the prophet names Cyrus, centuries before he is born, signals a divine authority that transcends time. It is a powerful reminder that God's plan unfolds according to his perfect timing, even if that timing is not immediately apparent to those who live through the unfolding of history. The mention of Cyrus by name not only affirms God's control over the future, but also demonstrates his commitment to the promises he made to his people. In the historical context, The prophecy is fulfilled when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon and issues a decree that allows the Israelites to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This event, which would have seemed improbable or even impossible to the Israelites in exile, stands as a testimony to God's unwavering faithfulness to his promises. Isaiah 45, then, is a powerful reminder that God can and does use all means, whether through kings of other nations or seemingly coincidental events, to bring about his will and to restore his people. The role of Persia in the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem is one of the most profound examples of how God works through foreign powers to fulfill his promises. Following the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people faced a period of uncertainty and despair, with their holy city and the temple in ruins. Yet, God had already orchestrated the rise of a new power, the Persian Empire, to facilitate the restoration of Israel's spiritual center. Through the Persian rulers, particularly King Cyrus the Great, God set the stage for the return of the exiled Israelites to their land and the rebuilding of the temple. Cyrus, as foretold by the prophet Isaiah, was the instrument through which God's plan for Israel's restoration would unfold. In 539 BCE, when Cyrus conquered Babylon, he issued an edict that allowed the Israelites to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This decree, recorded in the Book of Ezra, marked a pivotal moment in history. Cyrus's recognition of the Jewish people's right to return to their land was not only a political act but also a religious one. By providing the necessary resources, including materials for construction and offering protection during the rebuilding process, the Persian king fulfilled God's prophecy. In doing so, he unwittingly became a key participant in the renewal of the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, the Israelites began the task of reconstructing the temple, with the full support of the Persian rulers. King Darius I, who succeeded Cyrus, continued this support, reaffirming Cyrus's decree and ensuring that the rebuilding process moved forward. Darius even ordered that resources be allocated to the project from the royal treasury, highlighting the importance Persia placed on the restoration of the Jewish people and their religious practices. The Persian Empire's involvement in the rebuilding of the temple was not just a matter of political expediency, but a recognition of the God of Israel's sovereignty and his covenant promises. The rebuilding of the temple was a crucial event in the life of the Jewish people. It marked the renewal of their relationship with God, symbolizing the restoration of divine favor and blessing. The temple was more than a physical structure. It represented the presence of God among his people, a place where sacrifices were made and where worship and communion with the divine could take place. For the Israelites, the return to their land and the rebuilding of the temple was a sign that God had not abandoned them, that he was still with them, and that his promises to their ancestors were being fulfilled. Persia's role in this process was not incidental. By facilitating the rebuilding of the temple, Persia played a central role in maintaining the covenant relationship between God and Israel. It was through Persian policy and royal decrees that the Jews were able to restore the temple and resume their worship practices. This act of divine intervention through the Persian rulers serves as a powerful reminder that God can use even the most unlikely of instruments to fulfill his purposes, and that his plans for his people are unstoppable, regardless of the forces of history. Through Persia, God ensured that the covenant with Israel remained intact, and the stage was set for the continuation of his work in the world. During the reign of the Persian kings, particularly the Achaemenid dynasty, the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world shifted dramatically, particularly in relation to the Greek city-states. The Persian Empire, at its peak, stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, encompassing a vast swath of territory that included regions pivotal to both biblical and historical narratives. However, the expansion of this empire brought it into direct conflict with the rising power of Greece, setting the stage for one of the most significant clashes in ancient history. Persia's influence over the Mediterranean world was immense. It was not just a military superpower but also a political force that shaped the economic and cultural interactions of the time. The Persian kings, particularly Darius the Great and his son Xerxes, sought to expand their empire into the heart of Europe, where the Greek city-states were gaining prominence. The Greeks, for their part, were determined to preserve their independence and way of life, often resisting the Persian attempts to assert dominance. This tension led to a series of conflicts known as the Greco-Persian Wars, which would ultimately define the future course of Mediterranean history. The biblical narrative, while not directly addressing these conflicts, offers a subtle backdrop to the events of the time. The Persian Empire's role in the biblical story was crucial, especially in the aftermath of the Babylonian exile, as Persia facilitated the return of the Israelites to their homeland. However, the geopolitical forces of the time embodied by the Persian Empire were also shaping the broader context in which these biblical events unfolded. The Persian Empire's interactions with the Greeks, therefore, must be seen not only in the context of empire building but also as a critical moment in history that would eventually affect the political landscape of the ancient Near East, influencing the rise of Hellenism and, later, the Roman Empire. The conflicts between Persia and Greece, culminating in the famous battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, marked a decisive turning point. Despite the might of the Persian forces, the Greek city-states were able to resist and eventually repel the Persian invasions, ensuring that Greek culture and influence would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries to come. This conflict also set the stage for the rise of Alexander the Great, who, in the years following the end of the Persian-Greek Wars, would lead a campaign to conquer Persia itself. In the broader context of biblical history, the geopolitical struggle between Persia and Greece highlights the fluid nature of empire building in the ancient world. Persia's decline and Greece's rise were not merely military but also cultural and philosophical shifts that would lay the foundation for the civilization that would shape much of Western thought. For the Jewish people, the influence of Persia and its eventual clash with Greece would lead to the Hellenistic period, a time that saw the spread of Greek culture throughout the Near East and the eventual conflicts over religious and cultural identity. This era of political and cultural upheaval would ultimately affect the Jewish people in profound ways, as they navigated the challenges of maintaining their religious identity in a rapidly changing world. The prophet Zechariah, in his later visions, presents a striking portrayal of Persia's role in the latter days, weaving together the themes of divine judgment, restoration, and ultimate victory. As part of the post-exilic prophets, Zechariah's prophecies not only offered encouragement to the Jewish people as they rebuilt their lives in Jerusalem, but also pointed toward a greater cosmic drama in which the nations, including Persia, would play significant roles. Zechariah's message was deeply rooted in the belief that God was sovereign over all nations, including Persia. Persia, which had been an instrument of God's will in the restoration of Israel, was not exempt from the prophetic vision of divine justice. While the Persian Empire had provided the necessary conditions for the return of the Jewish exiles and the rebuilding of the temple, Zechariah envisioned a time when God's judgment would ultimately be meted out on the nations that had once held Israel captive. Persia, in Zechariah's vision, would be included in this final reckoning. However, his message was not merely about destruction. It also spoke of God's plan for ultimate restoration. In Zechariah 9, the prophet declares God's coming judgment against the nations, with Persia symbolized as a significant adversary in the eschatological battle. Yet this prophecy is not just about military conquest, but about the shift in spiritual authority, where Israel's enemies, Persia among them, would be brought low, and God's kingdom would be established. The imagery of the sons of Greece in Zechariah's visions further connects the future conflict between Israel's enemies and the divine forces, showing how nations once mighty, like Persia, they would be swept aside in the light of God's victory. Yet, in the midst of this judgment, Zechariah's prophecy does not solely focus on destruction. Instead, it offers a vision of Israel's redemption. The Jewish people, once scattered and in exile, would be gathered together, and their enemies, including Persia, would be judged for their actions. This divine intervention and victory were not merely about earthly power struggles, but were a sign of God's ultimate plan to bring peace and justice to the world, establishing his reign over all nations. Zechariah also spoke of the coming of a king who would bring peace, a messianic figure whose rule would be marked by righteousness. This would be a time when the nations of the world, including Persia, would recognize the sovereignty of God and bow before his throne. The final victory over Persia, in this sense, was not just a military triumph, but a spiritual one, marking the establishment of God's kingdom in its fullness. Ultimately, Zechariah's prophecies of Persia serve as a reminder that while the nations may rise and fall, God's plan for his people will not be thwarted. The return of Israel, the triumph of God's kingdom, and the defeat of Persia and other nations are all part of the divine narrative that will culminate in the restoration of all things under God's eternal rule. In the realm of biblical eschatology, the Persian Empire's role is often re-examined in light of future events, particularly in the context of the rise of the Antichrist and the final battle at Armageddon. While the ancient Persian Empire has long been seen as an instrument of God's will for the restoration of Israel, some theological interpretations suggest that Persia, or its future counterparts, may have a role to play in the final days. The Antichrist, a figure who is described in biblical prophecy as a force of evil that will oppose Christ and deceive many during the end times, is often linked to the great powers of the earth that have opposed God's plan throughout history. As various kingdoms and empires are mentioned in the prophetic books, some scholars interpret Persia's historical influence as a type of precursor to the forces that will align with the Antichrist in the final battle. In the book of Daniel, for example, we see various beasts representing empires, with Persia being symbolized by the bear. The imagery suggests that just as Persia once played a role in divine judgment, it might also be involved in the eschatological upheaval that precedes Christ's return. Some eschatological viewpoints look at Persia in terms of a revived power or a modern-day equivalent, often relating to countries in the region of Iran today. This interpretation hinges on the belief that the Persian Empire, which was a key player in biblical prophecy, might re-emerge in the final days to challenge the forces of righteousness in the Battle of Armageddon. Iran's prominence in today's geopolitics, particularly its conflicts with Israel and Western powers, makes it a subject of much speculation among those who interpret biblical prophecies in a contemporary context. While the scriptures do not directly link Persia to the rise of the Antichrist, some suggest that the powers of the ancient empires, Persia included, may manifest in the final global conflict. The Book of Revelation, in its depiction of the Battle of Armageddon, speaks of a great conflict where the nations of the world align against the forces of good, led by Christ. While Revelation does not specifically name Persia, it speaks of the kings of the East coming to gather at this battle. Some theologians see this as a possible reference to the Persian Empire or its modern manifestation, arguing that Persia could play a key role in the Antichrist's coalition of nations that will oppose God's final reign. The convergence of political, military, and spiritual forces at this time is seen as the culmination of the struggle between good and evil. Ultimately, the influence of Persia in the last days, according to certain interpretations, is tied to the larger spiritual narrative of God's judgment upon the earth. Whether as a revived empire or through its modern political descendants, Persia is thought to be part of the eschatological drama, where the forces of evil, including the Antichrist, will unite against the divine plan. In this final battle, the ultimate victory will belong to Christ, bringing an end to the cycle of human history, where nations rise and fall, but God's kingdom remains eternal. Throughout the biblical narrative, Persian kings are often portrayed not merely as political figures but as instruments of God's judgment, used by the divine to fulfill his will and carry out his purposes in the world. The role of these kings, especially Cyrus the Great, is deeply theological, reflecting the belief that God is sovereign over all nations and uses even those who do not know him to carry out his plans for judgment and restoration. Cyrus, in particular, stands out as a prime example of this divine sovereignty. Though he was a pagan king, God declared him his anointed one, a title typically reserved for those in covenant with God. In the book of Isaiah, God calls Cyrus by name centuries before his rise to power, prophesying that he would conquer Babylon and allow the Jewish people to return to their land. This extraordinary declaration of divine purpose reveals how Persian kings were not just political leaders but essential agents in God's judgment against the nations, including Babylon, the empire that had oppressed Israel. Through Cyrus, God executed judgment upon Babylon for its pride and its cruelty toward God's people. Yet, at the same time, he used Cyrus to fulfill his promise of restoration to the Jews. This theological understanding extends beyond Cyrus to other Persian rulers, who continued the work of God's judgment. The Persian kings played pivotal roles in shaping the history of Israel, particularly in the return from exile and the rebuilding of the Temple in Jerusalem. Their policies were not merely political maneuvers but divine actions that aligned with God's covenant promises. When Persia rose to power, it overthrew the Babylonian Empire, and in doing so, it was fulfilling God's decree to judge Babylon for its arrogance and violence. The fall of Babylon, as recorded in the book of Daniel, was not just a historical event but a divine act of judgment, carried out through the Persian kings. Moreover, the theological understanding of Persian kings as instruments of judgment emphasizes the belief that all earthly rulers, whether they acknowledge God or not, are ultimately under his control. In the grand narrative of Scripture, even the most powerful empires and rulers are seen as players in a cosmic drama that unfolds according to God's will. Whether in the rise and fall of nations or the bringing about of justice, God's hand is believed to be at work, orchestrating the events of history. In this way, the Persian kings embody the larger biblical theme of God's providence and judgment. While their reigns were marked by human ambition and earthly conquest, they also serve as a reminder that God's purposes are carried out through all circumstances, often in ways that transcend human understanding. Persia's role in the biblical story reveals the ongoing truth that God uses all nations, even those outside his direct covenant, to fulfill his divine plan for the world. The Persian kings, though pagan, were nonetheless agents of God's justice and mercy, fulfilling his will in ways that extended far beyond their own recognition or intent. King Darius, who reigned over the Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE, holds a significant place in both historical and biblical contexts. His rule marked a period of stability and expansion for the Persian Empire, but it is in the realm of biblical prophecy and moral lessons that his legacy takes on a deeper significance. In the book of Daniel, Darius is portrayed as a key figure in the unfolding of God's plan for Israel, particularly in the events surrounding the prophet Daniel's life. The historical importance of Darius lies in his establishment of Persian rule over Babylon after the fall of the Babylonian Empire. In biblical terms, Darius is depicted as a ruler who, although not a follower of the God of Israel, was used by God to fulfill his divine plan. Darius's decree to allow the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild Jerusalem was a direct result of God's sovereignty over the nations. In the book of Daniel, we see Darius play a pivotal role in the events surrounding Daniel's unwavering faith, especially when he was thrown into the lion's den. This moment, where Darius reluctantly gave the order for Daniel to be cast into the den, only to witness God's miraculous deliverance, serves as a testament to the power and protection of God, even in the most perilous of situations. Darius's response to this miracle, declaring the greatness of the God of Daniel, reveals his recognition of divine power, albeit as a result of his own experience with God's judgment. The moral and spiritual lessons from King Darius's reign are numerous and deeply rooted in the biblical narrative. One of the most significant lessons is the importance of integrity and unwavering faith, exemplified through the story of Daniel. Darius's actions in the story, his decision to follow the decree that led to Daniel's near death, demonstrate the human struggle between political expediency and moral conviction. His realization that God's will had been accomplished, even despite his own lack of understanding, offers a profound reminder of the sovereignty of God over the affairs of men. King Darius's rule also highlights the theme of repentance and humility. After witnessing Daniel's miraculous survival, Darius not only acknowledged the greatness of Daniel's God, but also proclaimed a decree throughout his entire kingdom that all people should reverence the God of Israel. This declaration marks a moment of moral growth for Darius, who, like many rulers before him, was humbled by the divine intervention in the life of his servant. It is a reminder that even the most powerful of rulers, in the face of God's authority, must recognize their own limitations and the supremacy of divine will. In the broader biblical narrative, King Darius represents the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Through his decree, the Jews were given the opportunity to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, an act that would lay the foundation for the eventual restoration of God's people. The moral lessons from Darius's life, his acknowledgement of God's power, his repentance, and his decree to honor the God of Israel, continue to resonate as timeless reminders of the importance of humility, faith, and the recognition of God's sovereignty in all things. In the prophetic book of Zephaniah, the role of Persia is not explicitly mentioned, but the themes of divine justice and judgment against surrounding nations are clear. Zephaniah, prophesying in the 7th century BCE, spoke of God's judgment on Judah, its enemies, and the nations around it. Persia, rising to prominence in the following century, would play a significant role in the fulfillment of those prophecies, albeit indirectly. Through the lens of Zephaniah's prophecy, Persia's actions and its role in the geopolitical landscape could be seen as a fulfillment of God's sovereign plan to bring justice to the nations. Zephaniah's prophecies are framed within the broader narrative of judgment against the nations, particularly against those who had turned away from God. The prophet speaks of the coming day of the Lord, a time when God will bring judgment upon the wicked, purging the earth of evil and restoring righteousness. While Zephaniah's direct focus is on Judah's impending judgment, he does not shy away from proclaiming God's judgment upon surrounding nations, including the Philistines, Moabites, Ammonites, and others. These nations, characterized by idolatry, oppression, and violence, are condemned for their actions, and Zephaniah prophesies that they will face divine retribution. Although Persia is not explicitly named, the empire's eventual role in the judgment of these nations cannot be overlooked. Persia's rise, particularly under King Cyrus, would be the instrument by which God would execute judgment on Babylon, a nation that had violently conquered Israel and oppressed God's people. Zephaniah's prophecies of divine retribution are fulfilled when Persia, under Cyrus, defeats Babylon and allows the Jewish people to return to their land. This historical event aligns with Zephaniah's vision of God using foreign nations to carry out his justice. In a sense, Persia becomes part of God's plan to bring judgment and restoration. The alignment of Persian actions with divine justice is seen in how Persia's rise to power serves to fulfill God's judgment against the arrogance and idolatry of Babylon. Babylon had been a dominant force, and its oppression of Israel and other nations was part of the larger story of human pride and disobedience. Zephaniah speaks of the coming judgment as not just a purging of Israel's enemies, but as a restoration of righteousness, which is exemplified in how Persia's conquest of Babylon brings an end to the idolatry and violence that had flourished under Babylonian rule. Ultimately, Zephaniah's prophecy serves as a reminder that God's justice is not confined to Israel but extends to the nations. The rise of Persia and its actions in overthrowing Babylon can be understood as a part of God's sovereign will, using Persia to fulfill the divine judgment that Zephaniah foretold. While Persia may have been an empire driven by its own ambitions, in the context of Zephaniah's prophetic framework, Persia's role is that of an instrument of divine justice, aligning with the broader narrative of God's judgment upon the nations and his ultimate plan for the restoration of his people. During the period of exile, Persia's influence on the geopolitical landscape and the cultural dynamics of Israel was profound and transformative. Following the fall of Babylon, which had previously conquered Israel and taken its people into exile. The rise of Persia under King Cyrus brought a new chapter for the Israelites. The geopolitical shifts created by Persia's expansion altered the power dynamics in the ancient Near East, and Persia's policies toward its new subjects, including Israel, reflected the empire's diplomatic acumen and strategic foresight. Persia's approach to the nations under its rule, particularly Israel, was markedly different from that of the Babylonians. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus, implemented a policy of tolerance and restoration rather than destruction and oppression. This diplomatic strategy was part of a broader vision to consolidate power by gaining the loyalty of the peoples they conquered. For Israel, this was a turning point. Under Persian rule, the Jewish people, who had suffered under the oppressive reign of Babylon, found a new sense of hope. The Persian king, Cyrus, issued a decree allowing the Israelites to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. This act of restoration not only marked the end of the Babylonian exile, but also signaled a shift in the cultural and spiritual trajectory of Israel. Cyrus's decree to rebuild the temple was not merely a political maneuver, but also a religious and cultural gesture that acknowledged the significance of the Jewish people. The restoration of the temple was a symbol of God's favor and a reaffirmation of Israel's identity as the chosen people. Persia's influence during the exile thus had a dual impact. It restored the physical and spiritual home of the Israelites and allowed for the rebuilding of their religious practices, which had been interrupted by their exile. This act of religious restoration would have far-reaching consequences for Jewish culture and identity, especially in the development of synagogue worship and the shaping of post-exilic Judaism. In addition to the rebuilding efforts, Persia's kings employed a diplomatic strategy that involved engaging with neighboring nations, including Israel, in a way that promoted peace and stability within the empire. While maintaining control over their vast territories, Persian kings such as Cyrus and Darius used local rulers and religious leaders as intermediaries, allowing them a degree of autonomy. This policy of religious tolerance ensured that conquered peoples, including the Israelites, could maintain their cultural identities and religious practices. For Israel, this meant that the exile was not only a period of suffering but also one of survival and continuity, as they were allowed to practice their faith and engage with their traditions despite being far from their ancestral homeland. The Persian influence, however, extended beyond the borders of Israel, affecting the broader geopolitical scene. Persia's rise to dominance over Babylon also impacted other nations in the region, forcing neighboring powers to adapt to the new order. Persia's diplomatic relations with these nations, including Israel's neighbors, were characterized by a pragmatic approach to governance, where the Persian kings sought alliances, negotiated peace, and maintained stability through mutual respect for local customs and traditions. In essence, Persia's influence during the exile was a transformative force for Israel. The Persian kings' policies of restoration, tolerance, and diplomacy allowed for the survival and eventual flourishing of Israel's cultural and religious identity, even in the midst of exile. The diplomatic strategies employed by Persia were instrumental in shaping the future of Israel and its place in the broader geopolitical world. The Persian monarchs played a pivotal role in the history of Israel, as their reigns shaped not only the fate of the Jewish people, but also the broader course of the ancient world. Among the most significant of these rulers were Darius, Artaxerxes, and Xerxes, whose actions left an indelible mark on Israel's spiritual and geopolitical landscape. Darius I, also known as Darius the Great, is perhaps best remembered in the Bible for his involvement in the restoration of the Jewish people. After the Babylonian exile, it was Darius who reaffirmed the Edict of Cyrus, the first Persian king, allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. His reign, noted for its administrative efficiency, also provided a stable environment for the Jews to resume their religious practices. Under Darius, the rebuilding of the temple was completed, which not only marked the physical restoration of the Jewish center of worship, but also symbolized the spiritual renewal of the Jewish people. Darius's role in facilitating this restoration demonstrated the Persian policy of religious tolerance and practical governance, which allowed Israel to flourish once again in its homeland. Artaxerxes I, another significant figure in the Persian Empire, had a complex relationship with the Jewish people. His reign is particularly noted in the biblical accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah, where his decrees supported the further rebuilding efforts in Jerusalem, including the fortification of the city's walls. The assistance Artaxerxes provided, particularly to Nehemiah, a Jewish official in his court, allowed for the physical security of Jerusalem, which was critical for the survival of the Jewish community. In addition, Artaxerxes' influence ensured that the spiritual reforms initiated by Ezra could take hold, cementing the Jewish people's religious identity and practices after their return from exile. Despite some tension and opposition from surrounding enemies, Artaxerxes' support provided the foundation for Israel's resurgence as a people dedicated to the worship of the one true God. Xerxes I, another prominent Persian king, is best known in the biblical context for his involvement in the events surrounding the Book of Esther. His reign, marked by political intrigue and military campaigns, became a backdrop for the salvation of the Jewish people in Persia. The story of Queen Esther, set during Xerxes' rule, highlights both the peril and the providence that characterized the Jewish experience under Persian rule. While Xerxes himself may not have directly impacted the fate of Israel through policy, his court and the intrigue within it created the circumstances for God to deliver the Jewish people from annihilation. Through the courage of Esther and her uncle Mordecai, the Jewish people were spared from the genocide that had been orchestrated by Haman, a royal official. In this story, Xerxes' role was more passive, yet his kingship provided the stage for divine intervention, demonstrating how even the most powerful monarchs could be used in God's greater plan. Together, the reigns of Darius, Artaxerxes, and Xerxes shaped not only the fate of Israel but also the wider world in which they lived. The Persian Empire, under these kings, allowed for the Jewish people to return to their land, rebuild their temple, and fortify their city. These events set the stage for the eventual spread of Judaism and, later, the rise of Christianity. The Persian monarchs, through their policies and decisions, facilitated the survival of the Jewish people and played a crucial role in the history of God's covenant with Israel, ultimately contributing to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The Persian Empire, with its vast reach and influence, stands as one of history's most notable empires, whose actions and policies have long been the subject of reflection, especially in relation to biblical and moral perspectives. At the heart of these reflections lies the ethical question of Persian imperialism and how the rulers of Persia governed their vast territories, including the lands of Israel. While the Persian Empire is often lauded for its policies of tolerance and respect for local traditions, the moral implications of imperialism under Persian rule cannot be overlooked, particularly when examined through the lens of divine justice as seen in the Bible. The Persian kings, particularly Cyrus the Great, are celebrated in the Bible for their role in the return of the Jewish people from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the Temple in Jerusalem. Yet, despite this positive legacy, the question remains: was the expansion of the Persian Empire, like all imperial endeavors, ethically justified? From a biblical standpoint, it is clear that Persia's actions were not simply political. They were also viewed as part of God's broader plan for Israel. The biblical narrative often depicts Persia's rise to power not as a conquest motivated by pure ambition, but as a tool in God's hands to carry out divine judgment against Babylon and to restore Israel. This alignment between Persia's rise and God's will suggests that, even in the morally ambiguous context of imperialism, Persia's role was viewed as part of a greater divine justice. However, the moral implications of Persian rule raise important questions. The very nature of imperialism, where one nation dominates and governs over others, poses ethical dilemmas, especially when it involves the imposition of foreign authority, even if that rule is relatively benign compared to other empires. Persian rulers, while often seen as benevolent and just in comparison to their contemporaries, still held absolute power over vast and diverse populations. The Persian kings exercised control over peoples from Egypt to India, and while they generally respected the customs and religions of those they ruled, their empire was built on the foundation of subjugation. The imperial practice of establishing control over other nations and peoples, though not as violent as the Babylonian or Assyrian empires, still represents an ethical concern, particularly when it comes to the autonomy and freedom of those peoples. The concept of divine justice applied to Persian imperialism is crucial in understanding the biblical narrative. In the Bible, God uses the Persian Empire as an instrument of judgment and redemption, suggesting that Persia's imperial actions, though politically and ethically questionable, were part of God's divine plan. This raises the challenging idea that empires, through their moral and immoral actions, may still play a role in fulfilling divine purposes, even if their practices are not without flaws. Persia's role in bringing justice to Babylon and allowing Israel to return to its land speaks to the complexity of moral governance in the ancient world, where ethical decisions often overlap with divine will. Ultimately, the ethical question of Persian imperialism remains multifaceted. While Persian rule is depicted as relatively just and benevolent in the biblical context, the empire's expansion, like that of all empires, brings to light the inherent tensions between power, justice, and the rights of those governed. Persia's role in history, both in the Bible and beyond, forces us to confront the complexities of imperialism, governance, and divine justice, reminding us that even actions we view as morally justifiable may be part of a broader, often hidden, divine narrative. In the book of Revelation, the narrative of the final days unfolds with vivid imagery and complex symbolism, outlining a cosmic struggle between the forces of good and evil. Among the nations mentioned, Persia, though not directly named, plays an intriguing eschatological role in the unfolding prophecy, particularly in its connection to the final battle at Armageddon. The text, filled with apocalyptic visions, hints at Persia's significance in the latter stages of human history, particularly in the context of the conflict between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness. While Persia is not mentioned explicitly in Revelation, its influence can be inferred through its symbolic connections to the larger geopolitical entities of the time. The ancient Persian Empire, now largely subsumed into the greater biblical narrative, emerges in Revelation as part of the broader nations that will gather against God's people in the final days. In the Battle of Armageddon, Revelation speaks of kings from the East coming to participate in the ultimate confrontation. Historically, the Persian Empire, located in the east of the ancient world, symbolizes the powerful nations that will rise in opposition to God's kingdom. The forces from the East, often associated with Persia or its successors, are said to unite in the final conflict, signaling a shift from the peace that the kingdom of God promises to the turmoil and destruction wrought by those who oppose divine rule. The prophecy of Armageddon itself speaks of a great gathering of armies, with the forces of darkness rallying together under the leadership of the Antichrist and his cohorts. These armies will converge at the plain of Megiddo, where the ultimate battle will take place. The connection to Persia lies in the symbolic idea that the powers of the East, which at the time of the writing of Revelation could be seen as Persia and its surrounding kingdoms, will have a significant role in this gathering. Persia, with its historical strength, vast territory, and influence over surrounding nations, fits the description of the Eastern powers that will rise to challenge the forces of good. These nations, including Persia, will be drawn into the final conflict, showing the continuing influence of ancient empires on the unfolding of the divine plan. Revelation's portrayal of Persia is not one of mere political might, but one of spiritual opposition, where nations historically associated with power and conquest now serve as part of the forces that challenge the divine order. This connection draws attention to the ongoing spiritual struggle between the forces of light and darkness, where even the great empires of history are used in God's sovereign plan to bring about the final redemption of the world. The role of Persia, while symbolic, reinforces the idea that no earthly power is beyond God's control, and even those powers that oppose him ultimately play a part in fulfilling his ultimate purpose. The inclusion of Persia in the eschatological visions of Revelation invites reflection on the enduring struggle between earthly empires and divine sovereignty. Persia's historical role in Scripture, from its support of Israel's return to the land to its place in the apocalyptic future, highlights the complex relationship between divine judgment, human agency, and the unfolding of God's will. As the nations of the world come together in opposition, the story of Persia in Revelation serves as a reminder of the ultimate victory of God's kingdom over all earthly powers, no matter their historical significance. Throughout the history of God's chosen people, the Jewish people have endured many trials, exiles, and foreign rulers. Among these rulers, Persia stands as one of the most significant, not only for its role in the geopolitical landscape, but also for its profound influence on the spiritual and cultural identity of Israel. Despite Persia's dominance, the covenant between God and his people remained unbroken, illustrating how God's plan for Israel transcends human kingdoms and rulers. Persia's relationship with Israel, particularly after the Babylonian exile, was pivotal in ensuring the survival and restoration of the Jewish people. After the fall of Babylon, the Persian Empire, under the rule of King Cyrus the Great, took a different approach to the conquered nations. Unlike previous empires that sought to erase the cultural and religious identity of their subjects, the Persians, under Cyrus's decree, allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This decree fulfilled the prophecy in Isaiah, where Cyrus is described as God's anointed one, chosen to restore Israel and facilitate the return of the exiles. Persia's policy toward the Jews was not one of domination but of support, which was extraordinary for an empire of its size and power. The Jewish people, who had endured the destruction of the First Temple and the devastation of the Babylonian exile, found in Persia a ruler who honored their customs and allowed them to preserve their religious practices. The restoration of the temple was not just an architectural project but a spiritual renewal that reconnected the Jewish people with their covenantal promises. The influence of Persian rule allowed the Jewish people to regain their place in the world as a nation devoted to God. Moreover, Persia's influence went beyond political support. Under Persian rule, the Jewish community began to solidify its religious and cultural identity. The period of exile and the return to Jerusalem marked a significant transition in Jewish history. The rebuilding of the temple and the practice of worship according to the laws of Moses were reaffirmed during this time. Ezra, the priest and scribe, played a crucial role in this spiritual renewal by leading the people in the rediscovery of the Torah. Nehemiah, too, contributed to the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, ensuring the physical security of the city and, by extension, the Jewish people. The Persian period also saw the development of Jewish religious institutions, such as the synagogue, which would later become central to Jewish life, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple. This institution, likely influenced by Persian models of administration and community, became the focal point for worship, study, and the preservation of Jewish traditions in the diaspora. In the broader context of God's covenant with Israel, Persia's role served as a reminder that divine promises endure beyond earthly rulers. Even in the midst of foreign domination, God's plan for Israel unfolded, and his people were guided back to their land, strengthened in their faith, and renewed in their commitment to him. Persia, in its time, became an instrument of God's will, ensuring the preservation of Israel's identity and their eventual return to their covenantal homeland. After the devastation of the Babylonian exile, the rebuilding of Jerusalem emerged as a beacon of hope and restoration for the Jewish people. The Persian dynasty, under the rule of Cyrus the Great and his successors, played a crucial role in this revival, providing not just political support but also spiritual encouragement. The decree issued by Cyrus in 538 BCE to allow the Jews to return to their homeland marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Persian Empire actively facilitated the restoration of Jerusalem and the re-establishment of the Jewish people in their ancestral land. This decree was not merely an act of benevolence. It was the fulfillment of God's prophecy, as seen in the words of Isaiah, who spoke of a king named Cyrus, by name, centuries before his rise. God, in his sovereignty, used the Persian rulers as instruments to bring about the restoration of his people. Cyrus's edict allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, an act that not only restored the physical infrastructure of the city but also revived the spiritual life of the nation. The support provided by the Persian dynasty was not limited to a mere allowance for the Jewish return. Persian rulers, particularly Darius I and Artaxerxes I, supported the project of rebuilding with royal edicts and financial backing. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the governor appointed by Persia, and the high priest Joshua, the foundations of the Second Temple were laid. The Persian Empire's backing was instrumental in overcoming the opposition from surrounding nations who sought to disrupt the rebuilding efforts. With the financial resources and the military protection of Persia, the Jewish people were able to resume the work of reconstruction, and in 516 BCE, the Second Temple was completed. Politically, the return to Jerusalem under Persian rule represented a significant shift for the Jewish people. While they had been under the oppressive thumb of Babylon, Persia offered a different kind of governance. The Persians were known for their policy of toleration and support for local cultures and religions, in contrast to the Babylonians, who sought to erase the cultural identity of their subjects. The Persian kings respected the traditions and religious practices of the conquered nations. This respect allowed the Jewish people to regain their sense of identity and continuity. Under Persian rule, the Jewish people were able to re-establish the religious and cultural institutions that had been disrupted during the exile. The rebuilding of the temple was not just a political act. It was a spiritual renewal that reignited the covenant relationship between God and Israel. The spiritual and political changes that came with the rebuilding of Jerusalem under Persian rule were profound. It marked a new phase in Jewish history, where the Jews, once again, were able to worship freely in their own land. The influence of the Persian dynasty laid the foundation for the future development of Jewish religious practices, including the rise of the synagogue, which would later become central to Jewish life, particularly after the destruction of the Second Temple. Thus, the rebuilding of Jerusalem under the Persian Empire was more than just a physical restoration. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Israel, one where political support, spiritual revival, and divine intervention came together to secure the future of God's chosen people. The return of the Jewish people from exile in Persia marked not only a physical restoration of the land, but also a profound spiritual revival. The Persian Empire, under kings like Cyrus and Artaxerxes, played an unexpected but significant role in facilitating this revival, helping to restore the religious practices and beliefs that had been disrupted during the Babylonian exile. While Persia was a foreign empire, its rulers saw the importance of maintaining the religious and cultural identity of the Jewish people. This respect for local customs and faiths laid the groundwork for a spiritual purification that would echo through Israel's history. The most significant aspect of this spiritual revival was the return to Torah observance. During the exile, many Jewish people had struggled to maintain their faith and identity, as the Babylonian and then Persian influences sought to assimilate them into the wider empire. The destruction of the First Temple and the loss of sovereignty had left the Jewish people in a vulnerable position, both physically and spiritually. Yet, the Persian rulers' policy of religious tolerance allowed the Jewish people to rediscover their roots and embrace the commandments of the Torah once again. Under the leadership of figures like Ezra and Nehemiah, who were appointed by the Persian kings, the Jewish people began to return to the observance of Torah laws. Ezra, a priest and scribe, was instrumental in the spiritual revival of Israel. He led the people in the public reading of the Torah, rediscovering God's law and calling the people to repentance. It was during this time that the Jewish people committed themselves once more to the covenant, renewing their vows to follow the commandments and live in accordance with the Torah. The return to the Torah was not just a religious revival. It was a reaffirmation of Israel's identity as a chosen people, bound to God through His law. The role of the Persian kings in this spiritual purification cannot be understated. King Cyrus's decree to allow the Jews to return to their land and rebuild the temple was the first step in the restoration process. His edict, which was seen as a fulfillment of prophecy, showed that Persia, despite being a foreign empire, played a part in God's plan for Israel. Under the subsequent Persian rulers, such as Artaxerxes, the Jewish community was given the support and protection needed to continue their religious practices. The king even provided financial resources for the rebuilding of the temple and the support of the priesthood. This patronage was crucial in maintaining the religious framework that would shape Israel's future spiritual life. The return to Torah observance and the restoration of the temple worship allowed the Jewish people to purify their spiritual lives, re-establishing the relationship between Israel and God. The rebuilding of the temple was more than just a construction project. It was a symbolic act of restoring the connection between heaven and earth. The Persian Empire's involvement in this process, though primarily political, allowed for the conditions under which Israel's spiritual revival could take place. The Jewish people, with the support of Persia, found a renewed sense of purpose and identity through their faith, forever shaping the course of their religious history. In the Book of Daniel, Persia is prominently featured in a series of prophetic visions that outline not only its rise to power, but also its eventual downfall. These prophecies, delivered by the prophet Daniel during the Babylonian exile, offer a strikingly detailed narrative of the empires that would shape the world, with Persia occupying a significant place within this unfolding vision. Daniel's prophecies, delivered through symbolic dreams and visions, provide a framework for understanding Persia's role in God's broader plan for history and the future. One of the most notable visions in Daniel involves the great image of 4 kingdoms, where Persia is represented by the chest and arms of silver. This image, described in Daniel 2, reflects the historical progression of empires, with the silver signifying Persia's dominance following Babylon's fall. The image further suggests that while Persia would be a powerful and prosperous empire, it would eventually give way to another, symbolized by the bronze of the Greek Empire. This shift in power, while historically accurate, also hints at the eventual vulnerability of Persia, pointing to a future where its greatness is surpassed. Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat in chapter 8 is another key prophecy concerning Persia. In this vision, the ram represents the kings of Media and Persia, while the goat represents the Greek Empire, led by Alexander the Great. The ram's power is seen in its dominance and strength, but the goat swiftly defeats it, symbolizing the swift and decisive conquest of Persia by Alexander. This vision highlights not only the strength and prominence of Persia in its time, but also its eventual downfall, marked by the rise of a new power. The angel Gabriel further interprets these visions for Daniel, revealing that Persia's reign, though significant, would not last forever. The conflict between the ram and the goat symbolizes the tensions between Persia and Greece, with Persia being overtaken by the swift and unrelenting forces of Alexander's empire. The rise of Greece as the dominant power serves as a backdrop to the ultimate fate of Persia, with its glory and strength gradually fading into history. The prophecies of Daniel underscore a central theme: the transient nature of earthly empires. Persia's greatness, symbolized by the ram, was a temporary phase in the unfolding divine plan. Daniel's visions not only provide insight into the historical trajectory of Persia, but also point to a deeper spiritual reality that all nations, no matter how mighty, are subject to the sovereignty of God. Persia's eventual downfall, at the hands of Greece, was not just a political shift. It was a fulfillment of divine prophecy, demonstrating God's control over the rise and fall of empires. These prophecies serve as a reminder that while Persia was a key player in the biblical narrative, its role in the grand story of redemption is ultimately limited. The future of Persia, as seen in Daniel's visions, was always intertwined with the broader divine narrative, a narrative in which God's will prevails, and the empires of men rise and fall according to his purpose. Under Persian rule, the Jewish people faced a series of spiritual trials and tests that both challenged and strengthened their faith. After the fall of Babylon, the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great, granted the Jewish exiles the opportunity to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. However, while this decree provided hope for the restoration of their homeland, the journey back to spiritual and physical restoration was far from straightforward. The return from exile marked the beginning of a period of spiritual trials. The Jewish people had lived in exile for decades, and many had grown accustomed to life in Babylon and Persia. The generational gap between those who had lived in Jerusalem and those born in exile created a divide in their religious practices. While the older generation longed to return to the land of their ancestors and rebuild the temple, many of the younger generation had assimilated into the Persian way of life and had become disconnected from the practices and traditions of their forefathers. This presented a significant challenge for the leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, who sought to guide the people back to their covenantal faithfulness. Despite the decree from Cyrus, the Jewish people faced resistance from local inhabitants, including the Samaritans, who sought to thwart the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its temple. These external pressures brought a spiritual test to the people of Israel, as they struggled to balance their commitment to God with the challenges of rebuilding in a foreign land. The opposition to their efforts created an environment where the Jewish people were forced to confront their own doubts and fears about God's promises. Yet, through these trials, their faith was tested and purified. The rebuilding of the temple became a symbol of hope, reminding them of God's faithfulness and His power to restore His people, even in the midst of adversity. Persia's role in this period was twofold. On the one hand, the Persian kings, particularly Cyrus, provided the Jewish people with the political and material support they needed to rebuild their city and temple. On the other hand, the Jewish people had to navigate the challenges of living under a foreign empire that did not share their religious beliefs. This forced them to wrestle with issues of identity, assimilation, and spiritual integrity. They were constantly reminded that while they were given the freedom to practice their faith, they lived in a world that did not fully understand or honor their God. Throughout these years, the Jewish people experienced a deepening of their faith. The hardships they faced under Persian rule helped them to return to their spiritual roots, as they rediscovered the importance of the law and the covenant with God. The rebuilding of the temple became not just an architectural feat, but a spiritual one, as it marked the restoration of God's presence among His people. In the end, Persia's influence on the Jewish people was not merely political, but also deeply spiritual, shaping the trajectory of their faith and their understanding of God's provision and guidance in times of trial. During the Persian era, Jerusalem held a deeply symbolic role in biblical prophecy, signifying not just the restoration of a city, but the restoration of God's covenant with His people. The Persian kings, in their unique position as rulers of a vast empire, became instruments in fulfilling divine promises, particularly the prophecy of Jerusalem's restoration. This period marked a pivotal moment for Israel, as the Persian rulers, especially King Cyrus, were viewed as chosen by God to initiate the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. The rebuilding of Jerusalem, and especially the temple, symbolized more than a physical restoration. It was a spiritual revival, a renewed opportunity for Israel to restore its relationship with God. Cyrus's decree to allow the exiles to return to Jerusalem was seen by the Jewish people as a fulfillment of prophecy. In Isaiah 45, Cyrus is even called God's anointed one, despite not being of the Israelite faith, highlighting the idea that God could use even foreign kings to achieve His divine will. By allowing the Jewish people to return to their ancestral land and rebuild the temple, Persia facilitated the restoration of Jerusalem as a center of worship and a symbol of God's presence on earth. The Persian kings' policies of religious tolerance and their understanding of the importance of the Jewish faith to their own empire allowed for a period of relative peace, which was crucial for the rebuilding efforts. However, the role of Jerusalem in God's plan went beyond just the physical city itself. Jerusalem was seen as the heart of God's kingdom on earth, a place where heaven and earth intersected. The city held the promises of God's faithfulness to his people, and the restoration of its walls and temple was a sign of God's ultimate victory over the forces that had opposed his people. This was particularly evident in the way the Persian kings, such as Darius and Artaxerxes, supported the Jewish people in their religious and political aspirations. They not only provided the materials and permission for rebuilding, but also offered protection from surrounding nations who sought to disrupt these efforts. The Persian king's involvement in Jerusalem's restoration had lasting theological implications. It showed the sovereignty of God over history, as even the greatest empires of the world were used to accomplish his will. The restoration of Jerusalem under the Persians was not merely a political or military achievement. It was a divine act that demonstrated God's commitment to his people and his plan for the salvation of the world. The Persian kings, though secular rulers, played an integral role in the fulfillment of God's promises, reminding the Jewish people that God was still actively guiding history toward its appointed end. Thus, during the Persian era, Jerusalem was not just a city to be rebuilt, it was a symbol of God's faithfulness, and through the involvement of the Persian kings, God's plan for Israel was brought closer to fruition. This period stands as a testament to the mysterious ways in which God uses even the most unexpected instruments to fulfill his divine purposes, confirming the enduring significance of Jerusalem in the biblical narrative. In the book of Revelation, Persia's future is not merely a historical reference but an eschatological symbol, intricately woven into the final days of God's plan for humanity. While Persia itself had long ceased to be a dominant power by the time Revelation was written, its significance in the prophetic narrative remains profound. The ancient empire, like so many others before it, is seen in the context of the great cosmic struggle between good and evil, the forces of darkness and the divine judgment of God. In these final days, the nations, Persia included, will play a role in the unfolding of God's ultimate purpose, as the world prepares for the consummation of all things. The eschatological portrayal of Persia in Revelation draws attention to the broader role of the nations in the final battle, particularly in the prophetic imagery of the nations coming together for the climactic confrontation at Armageddon. In Revelation 16:12, it is said that the Euphrates River, historically a central boundary in the Persian Empire, will be dried up to make way for the kings of the East. This cryptic reference hints at the role Persia or its successors will play in the final confrontation. Though not explicitly named, the reference to the Eastern kings suggests that the descendants of the Persian Empire, or those who inherit its ancient position of power, will be among those who rally together in the final battle against the forces of good. Their involvement signals not only their geographic and political legacy, but also their spiritual significance as part of the nations that must face divine judgment. Persia's place in the final fulfillment of biblical prophecy is further highlighted by its connections to the broader theme of God's sovereignty over all nations. In the same way that Persia was used as an instrument of divine judgment in the Old Testament, so too will it play a part in the eschatological drama of the last days. The nations that opposed God's will throughout history, including Persia, will ultimately come together for one final stand against the kingdom of Christ, only to be defeated by the power of God. This theme echoes the prophetic writings that speak of God using various kingdoms and empires to fulfill his plan, sometimes for purposes of judgment and sometimes for purposes of restoration. As the world approaches its final days, the rise of powers from the East, including Persia, serves as a reminder of the continuity of God's overarching plan. Persia's role in the eschatological narrative reflects the recurring pattern of divine use of worldly powers, whether for punishment or prophecy. In the end, Persia's role will not be that of an eternal adversary, but as part of the larger movement towards God's ultimate victory over evil. The final judgment will be a reckoning not just for the Persian Empire but for all who have ever opposed God's divine will, culminating in the establishment of his eternal kingdom. Under the rule of Persia, Israel experienced a significant restoration, both physically and spiritually, that would shape its future identity. This period, marked by the reign of kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius the First, witnessed the fulfillment of prophetic promises and the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Persian Empire, after its conquest of Babylon, made a deliberate effort to restore the Jewish people to their land and faith. This restoration was not merely an act of benevolence but also aligned with Persia's strategic interests, ensuring stability within its vast empire and fostering loyalty among its diverse subjects. However, beneath this political motivation lay a divine hand, as the scriptures attest to the Persian kings being instruments of God's will. The rebuilding of the Second Temple, ordered by King Cyrus in 538 BCE, is one of the most significant events during Persian rule over Israel. After nearly 70 years of exile, the Jewish people were permitted to return to Jerusalem, a gesture that marked the end of their suffering and a fresh start in their homeland. The decree of Cyrus, which allowed the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple, was seen as a fulfillment of the prophecy found in the book of Isaiah. Not only was this an act of political restoration, but it was also deeply spiritual. The rebuilding of the temple symbolized the re-establishment of the covenant between God and his people, a sacred place where worship could once again be offered in the way prescribed by the Torah. The temple served as a reminder of God's faithfulness to his promises, even in the face of the Jewish people's disobedience and exile. The return to Jerusalem, however, was not without its challenges. The Jewish community faced opposition from surrounding nations, and the task of rebuilding the temple was slow and fraught with difficulties. Yet, under the leadership of figures like Zerubbabel, Joshua the high priest, and later Ezra and Nehemiah, the restoration project continued. The rebuilding of the city walls and the re-establishment of Jewish worship became a focal point of this restoration, symbolizing both the physical and spiritual renewal of Israel. Persian influence also extended beyond the rebuilding efforts, impacting the religious and cultural life of the Jewish people. The Persian kings allowed the Jewish people to practice their faith freely, and in many ways, the Persian system of governance shaped the way Judaism would develop in the coming centuries. The Persian commitment to religious tolerance likely provided the Jewish people with a sense of autonomy that was not afforded to them under previous empires. Additionally, the Persian period saw the strengthening of Jewish religious practices, including the formalization of the synagogue as a place of worship and study. This era, marked by Persian patronage, laid the foundation for the later development of Jewish religious and cultural institutions that would endure throughout history. In essence, the restoration of Israel under Persian rule was a pivotal moment in the history of the Jewish people. It was a time of rebuilding both the physical structure of their faith and the spiritual strength that had been threatened during their exile. Through the Persian kings, God's plan for the restoration of Israel unfolded, and the seeds of the Jewish faith, with its unique cultural and religious identity, were sown for generations to come. The influence of Persian rule on Jewish culture and religion cannot be understated, as it played a pivotal role in shaping the trajectory of Jewish identity in the post-exilic world. The return from Babylonian exile marked a profound transformation, and much of this change can be attributed to the policies of Persian kings, who, through their support, helped the Jewish people rediscover and rebuild their faith. The restoration of Jerusalem and the Second Temple under the Persian Empire laid the foundation for the religious and cultural practices that would define Judaism in the centuries to come. One of the most significant long-term impacts of Persian rule was the re-establishment of Jewish worship and the role of the temple. With the rebuilding of the Second Temple, which served as the center of Jewish religious life, the Jews were able to reconnect with their spiritual heritage in ways they had not been able to during their exile. The Persian rulers, particularly Cyrus the Great, encouraged the reconstruction of the temple, allowing the Jewish people to offer sacrifices and perform rituals that were central to their identity. This period saw a revival of the covenant relationship between God and Israel, which, over time, shaped the Jewish understanding of their special place in the world. The influence of Persian culture also contributed to the development of Jewish religious practices. The Jewish community, having lived under Persian governance, incorporated certain Persian administrative and cultural practices into their own systems. The organization of synagogues as places of worship, which became increasingly important during this time, was one such development. Persian respect for diverse religious practices and their institutionalization of governance provided the Jews with a model for community organization, which was particularly useful after their return from exile. Additionally, Persian tolerance and the lack of forced assimilation allowed Jews to retain their cultural distinctiveness, while also benefiting from the relative peace and stability of the Persian Empire. In the realm of scripture, the Persian period was also crucial in shaping Jewish religious thought. The influence of Persian dualism, with its emphasis on good and evil, might have contributed to the development of ideas about angels, demons, and the afterlife in Jewish thought. Persian thought systems often emphasized the struggle between light and darkness, a concept that found its way into Jewish theology, especially during the time of the later prophets. This period also marked a time when the Jewish people became more focused on the study of Torah and the preservation of their traditions. This intellectual shift, prompted in part by their time under Persian rule, laid the groundwork for the development of Rabbinic Judaism, which would define Jewish life for centuries to come. The lasting legacy of Persian influence on Jewish identity is also seen in the way Jewish leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah governed the Jewish community. The Persian king's policies of religious freedom allowed Ezra to reinstate the Torah as the central authority in Jewish life. Nehemiah's work in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem also symbolized the re-establishment of Jewish autonomy and national pride. These actions, rooted in the Persian context, helped shape Jewish identity in a way that would endure through subsequent foreign dominations, including the Greek and Roman empires. In the post-exilic world, the Jewish people not only regained their land and worship but also solidified a sense of community and faith that was rooted in both their historical past and the lessons learned during their time under Persian rule. The Persian period was a time of restoration, renewal, and transformation, one that would leave a lasting mark on Jewish culture, religion, and identity for generations to come. The role of Persia in the final redemption of Israel carries profound theological implications that reach deep into the heart of biblical prophecy and Jewish eschatology. While Persia's influence was historically marked by its contributions to the restoration of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the Temple, its ultimate place in the narrative of Israel's redemption extends far beyond the Persian Empire's political dominance. Prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures reveal that Persia, through its kings and actions, plays a pivotal part in the divine plan for the final restoration of the Jewish people. In biblical prophecy, Persia is depicted as an instrument in God's hands for the restoration of Israel, not just in the post-exilic era, but in a far-reaching, eschatological context. The prophecy of Isaiah, which speaks of Cyrus as God's anointed one, alludes to a broader divine purpose in which Persia's power is used to set the stage for Israel's ultimate redemption. Persia's support for the rebuilding of the Temple and its role in granting the Jews autonomy to return to their land are seen as steps in the fulfillment of a much larger plan that reaches into the future. In this theological framework, Persia's kings, especially Cyrus, are viewed as unwitting agents of God's larger mission to restore his chosen people. The connection between Persia and the final redemption can be found in the idea that the Persian kings, particularly Cyrus, are part of the divine orchestration of history. The prophecy of Cyrus, mentioned by Isaiah, emphasized that God had raised him up, despite his non-Jewish background, to fulfill a divine mission. In this sense, Persia represents more than a political entity. It is a symbol of God's ability to use any nation or ruler to bring about his will. The Persian Empire's role, therefore, is not just limited to the temporal restoration of Jerusalem, but also points toward a future where Israel is fully restored in a spiritual and eschatological sense. It signals that even the most unlikely of sources, nations like Persia, will play a key role in the final redemption. Theologically, Persia's involvement is often linked to the idea of the gathering of the exiles of Israel in the last days. The Jewish people, who were dispersed among the nations, are prophesied to be gathered back to the land of Israel as part of the final redemption. Persia's historic support for the Jewish return from Babylonian exile is viewed as a precursor to this greater gathering, where even nations that once opposed Israel will contribute to the people's return and spiritual renewal. The prophetic writings, particularly those in the book of Daniel and Ezekiel, reveal that the rise of Persia and its eventual role in the final redemption will be an essential part of the process in restoring the Jewish people to their God-given place. In the ultimate sense, Persia's involvement in Israel's redemption underscores the idea that God works through all of history, using even the mightiest empires to bring his plan to fruition. Persia's actions, which historically helped rebuild the Jewish people's physical and spiritual life, are seen as part of the broader narrative in which Israel's ultimate redemption will take place through divine intervention. Persia's role in the final redemption of Israel, as prophesied, highlights the unyielding power of God's covenant with his people, and the realization that, even in the midst of nations rising and falling, his divine plan remains intact and will ultimately be fulfilled. You are now going to write this chapter. Make it max 500 words long. The messianic prophecies woven throughout the Bible point to a future hope for Israel, where the long-awaited Messiah will come to restore the kingdom, bring peace, and fulfill God's promises to his people. While the Persian Empire itself is not directly associated with the coming of the Messiah, its role in the history of Israel, especially in the post-exilic period, serves as a crucial vehicle for the fulfillment of these prophecies. The Persian kings, most notably Cyrus, set in motion a series of events that paved the way for Israel's return to its land, the rebuilding of the temple, and the eventual spiritual revival of the Jewish people, all of which are integral elements in the broader messianic timeline. In the prophecies of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Messiah is often depicted as a king who will rule with justice, restore the throne of David, and establish God's kingdom on earth. The Persian Empire, through its policies and actions, indirectly influenced the environment in which these prophecies could unfold. After the fall of the Babylonian Empire, Persia became the dominant power, and under King Cyrus, Israel was allowed to return to its land, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and re-establish its religious practices. This period of restoration was not just a political act. It was seen as the preparation of God's people for the eventual arrival of the Messiah. Persia's role in the restoration of Jerusalem is often viewed as a stepping stone in the fulfillment of the messianic promises. Without the permission and support of Persian rulers, the physical and spiritual renewal of Israel may not have been possible. The return of the exiles, the rebuilding of the temple, and the re-establishment of the Jewish faith were all essential components in setting the stage for the coming of the Messiah. The prophets, including Isaiah, saw in Persia a tool of divine providence, even calling Cyrus the Anointed One, chosen to fulfill God's purpose. This indirect influence of Persia on the messianic timeline cannot be overstated, as it created the conditions in which the messianic age could eventually begin to take shape. Furthermore, the restoration of Israel under Persian rule was not just a return to the land but a return to God. The spiritual revival that accompanied this period was seen as a preparation for the Messiah's coming, as it renewed the Jewish people's relationship with God and reinvigorated their faith. The rebuilding of the temple was a pivotal event, symbolizing the restoration of God's presence among his people, a theme that would resonate in the messianic hope. In this sense, Persia serves as a catalyst for the messianic era, as it was during this time that Israel's spiritual, political, and cultural foundations were restored, all of which would play a role in the fulfillment of God's promises through the Messiah. While Persia itself did not directly bring about the Messiah, its actions provided the necessary framework for the messianic prophecies to unfold. The Persian period stands as a time of preparation, where God's people were re-established in their land, their faith was renewed, and the conditions were set for the Messiah's arrival. In this way, Persia indirectly influenced the messianic timeline, as its role in Israel's restoration set the stage for the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to send a Savior who, the legacy of Persia in the Bible, is deeply intertwined with the theme of redemption, a central thread that runs throughout the Scriptures. Persia's influence, particularly in the post-exilic period, plays a pivotal role in the unfolding divine plan for Israel's restoration and redemption. While Persia itself is not the focus of redemptive history, the Persian kings, such as Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, served as instruments of God's will, orchestrating events that would lead to the renewal of Israel and set the stage for the eventual coming of the Messiah. Persia's role in the redemption narrative begins with King Cyrus, who, by God's design, decreed the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon and the rebuilding of the Temple in Jerusalem. This act of restoration was not merely a political maneuver. It was a divine intervention that fulfilled the prophetic words of Isaiah, who had foreseen Cyrus's rise long before he was born. In Isaiah 45, God calls Cyrus his anointed one, a title that connects Persia's king to the larger redemptive framework. Cyrus's decree was the fulfillment of God's promise to restore his people, and it marked the beginning of a process that would see Israel return to its land, rebuild its faith, and ultimately witness the coming of the promised Savior. The Persian kings, though foreign rulers, were used by God to facilitate the restoration of Israel, allowing the Jewish people to regain their sovereignty and re-establish their religious practices. This period of rebuilding was essential for the fulfillment of the redemption narrative, as it provided the foundation for the spiritual and physical renewal that would later lead to the messianic promise. The support of the Persian rulers in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the Temple was a crucial part of God's plan to restore Israel to its rightful place in history, fulfilling the covenant he had made with his people. Furthermore, the influence of Persian rule extended beyond political restoration. It also played a significant role in the spiritual revival of the Jewish people. The return to Torah observance and the re-establishment of the temple worship were key components of Israel's redemption. Persian kings like Artaxerxes and Darius supported the efforts of Ezra and Nehemiah, who worked to restore the faith and practices of the Jewish people. Through their leadership, the Persian Empire provided the necessary resources and protection for the Jewish people to rebuild both their city and their relationship with God. In the grand narrative of redemption, Persia stands as a critical moment in the restoration of Israel. The Persian Empire, though not a lasting political power in biblical history, played an essential role in the spiritual and physical renewal of God's people. The kings of Persia acted as agents in God's redemptive plan, helping to shape the destiny of Israel and set the stage for the coming of the Messiah. This legacy of Persia serves as a reminder of God's sovereignty, showing that he uses even foreign powers to accomplish his divine will and bring about the ultimate redemption of the world. As the biblical narrative moves toward its conclusion, the role of Persia in the unfolding story of God's kingdom becomes more symbolic and prophetic. The final visions and prophecies regarding Persia speak not only to the historical power of the Persian Empire, but also to its ultimate place in God's redemptive plan. While Persia's role in the restoration of Israel was essential, the prophetic literature indicates that its influence, like all earthly kingdoms, would eventually give way to the kingdom of God. In the later chapters of Daniel, Persia is depicted as part of the great sequence of empires that would rise and fall. In Daniel's vision of the four beasts, Persia is symbolized as the bear, representing the might and power of the Persian Empire. The bear's 3 ribs in its mouth are often interpreted as a symbol of the 3 major conquests Persia made: Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, emphasizing Persia's significant territorial expansions. But as the vision continues, the rise of the Greco-Macedonian Empire, represented by the leopard, signals a shift in power, indicating that the Persian Empire, like all earthly empires, is temporary. The final prophetic visions in the Bible, particularly those in the book of Revelation, continue the theme of God's sovereignty over the kingdoms of the earth. The prophetic judgment of nations, including Persia, is woven into the eschatological narrative, where the ultimate victory belongs to God's eternal kingdom. Persia, like Babylon and other empires, is part of the larger prophetic warning about the futility of earthly powers that oppose God's will. As Revelation unfolds, it becomes clear that all nations, including Persia, will face judgment, and that their earthly rule will ultimately be replaced by the righteous reign of God. In this eschatological view, Persia's ultimate fate is not one of destruction alone, but rather its role in the grand scheme of God's plan for the world. While Persia served as an instrument of God's judgment against nations like Israel and others, the kingdom that Persia represented will be superseded by God's eternal kingdom. This divine kingdom, characterized by peace, justice, and righteousness, will replace the empires of man, bringing about the restoration of creation. Thus, the final prophecies regarding Persia emphasize the transitory nature of human kingdoms and the unshakable permanence of God's sovereign rule. Persia's influence, though significant in the history of Israel and the broader ancient world, will ultimately be eclipsed by the coming of the kingdom of God, where all nations will be gathered in worship and adoration of the true King. Persia's place in this narrative reflects the larger biblical theme that all earthly powers, no matter how mighty, will one day bow to the dominion of God's eternal reign. Persia's influence extended far beyond its own borders, leaving an indelible mark on the spiritual and theological landscape of the ancient world. As the Persian Empire expanded its reach, it encountered various cultures and nations, each of which was affected by Persian governance, policies, and religious practices. While Persia's role in the Bible is most notably associated with its relationship with Israel, the broader biblical narrative reveals the profound spiritual impact it had on neighboring peoples as well. One of the most significant aspects of Persia's influence was its policy of religious tolerance. Under the rule of Persian kings, particularly King Cyrus the Great, conquered nations were often allowed to maintain their own religious practices. This was a departure from the more oppressive policies of earlier empires, such as Babylon, where the exile of the Jewish people had been a symbol of divine judgment. The Persian kings' openness to religious diversity is seen in their support for the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, but their tolerance extended beyond Israel. For instance, the Persians allowed the return of the exiled Israelites and other displaced peoples, showing an understanding of the importance of worship and religious identity. This policy of religious tolerance had a ripple effect on the surrounding nations. It enabled the preservation of cultural and religious traditions in regions that might have otherwise been forced into assimilation. Persia's approach to governance allowed for the continued flourishing of various faiths and practices, from the Zoroastrian religion, which was the dominant faith of Persia, to the beliefs of smaller nations and tribes within the empire's vast borders. In a world where empires often sought to impose their own religious beliefs on conquered peoples, Persia's more open approach was a notable exception. The Persian Empire also played a role in the spiritual development of other nations through its influence on trade and diplomacy. As Persia controlled vast stretches of land, including important trade routes, it facilitated the exchange of ideas and spiritual concepts between the East and West. This interaction led to a blending of religious thought, with Persian ideas about divine kingship and governance influencing the theological discussions of neighboring cultures. For instance, the Zoroastrian concept of a single, all-powerful God and the idea of a cosmic struggle between good and evil resonated with later Jewish and Christian theological developments, including the concepts of heaven and hell, as well as the battle between good and evil in the final days. In addition to influencing the development of religious thought, Persia's presence in the Bible and its relationship with Israel contributed to the broader theological narrative of divine sovereignty and providence. Persia's rise and fall were seen as part of God's larger plan for the world, where even pagan nations were used as instruments of His will. The legacy of Persia is thus not only a matter of historical and political significance, but also one of theological importance. It demonstrated how God, in His sovereignty, could use any nation, whether it was Israel, Persia, or another empire, to fulfill His purposes in the world. Ultimately, Persia's spiritual impact on neighboring nations was profound, shaping not only the fate of Israel but also contributing to the larger story of God's work in history. Through its religious tolerance, diplomatic influence, and theological ideas, Persia left a lasting legacy that extended far beyond its borders, influencing the spiritual and theological development of nations for centuries to come. The legacy of Persia in biblical history extends far beyond the empire's territorial reach or its political might. Persia's spiritual and theological influence continues to resonate through the pages of Scripture, offering lasting insights into God's sovereignty and His relationship with nations. Persia's role in the Bible, particularly in the restoration of Israel, exemplifies how divine providence shapes history, using even the most unlikely of empires to fulfill His purposes. The lasting spiritual impact of Persia is woven into the biblical narrative, shaping the faith of the Jewish people and influencing the course of God's redemptive plan. One of the most profound contributions of Persia to the biblical story was its role in the return of the Jewish exiles from Babylon. Under King Cyrus, the Persian Empire not only conquered Babylon, but also allowed the Jewish people to return to their land and rebuild their temple. This decree, recorded in the Bible, stands as a testament to the sovereignty of God over the rulers of the earth. Cyrus, though a Gentile king, was referred to as God's anointed, a tool in His hands for the restoration of His people. The faithfulness of Persian kings, especially during the reigns of Cyrus and Artaxerxes, in supporting the rebuilding of Jerusalem, reinforced the idea that God can work through any nation to bring about His divine plan. This divine intervention, in which Persia became the instrument of Israel's restoration, emphasized a theological truth that resonates throughout Scripture. God's purposes prevail despite the political and cultural forces at play. The Persian kings were not merely rulers of a foreign empire. They were part of God's orchestration of history, demonstrating that His plan cannot be thwarted by human power or earthly opposition. The Israelites, despite their exilic experience and hardships, were able to return to their land, rebuild the temple, and re-establish their religious practices, a moment that carried significant theological weight. The spiritual and theological implications of Persia's role in Scripture extend into modern interpretations of biblical and history. Scholars and theologians continue to explore the ways in which God used Persia to fulfill His promises to Israel. The story of Persia's involvement in the restoration of the Jewish people is often seen as a powerful reminder that God works through history in ways that transcend human understanding. Persia's influence, while seemingly a footnote in the grander story of Israel, is a key part of the redemptive narrative, demonstrating how God remains in control, even when nations rise and fall. In modern interpretations of Scripture, Persia is seen not only as a historical entity, but as a symbol of divine providence. The rise of Persia and its impact on Israel is a reminder that God can use any power, even one that does not acknowledge Him, to accomplish His will. This serves as a profound message for today's world, where political, cultural, and social powers continue to shape the course of history. Persia's eternal impact on biblical history is, therefore, not just a historical fact but a continuing spiritual lesson, one that points to God's unshakable control over time and His unwavering commitment to His promises.